Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where winter wasn't just a season, it was an opportunity. Long before refrigerators quietly hummed in every kitchen, people relied on patience, determination, and thousands of tons of natural ice to survive the hottest months of the year. Our journey takes us to the frozen lakes and rivers of the Victorian era, where entire communities gathered during the coldest weeks of winter to harvest something that would slowly disappear beneath the summer sun. At first, it might sound like one of history's stranger occupations. Spending freezing mornings cutting giant blocks of ice by hand, walking behind horses across frozen lakes while hoping the surface beneath your feet stayed exactly where it was. Somehow, people managed to turn all of that into a thriving industry. And as we'll discover tonight, it made a surprising number of people very wealthy, provided they didn't accidentally drop half their fortune into an icy river first. But before we begin, if you enjoy relaxing history documentaries that help you unwind, fall asleep, or simply escape into fascinating moments from the past, I'd really appreciate it if you took a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. I always love seeing how many different countries gather here each night to explore history together. And if this video helps you relax, there's plenty more sleepy, historical journeys waiting for you here on the channel. Now dim the lights if you can, get comfortable beneath your favorite blanket, perhaps make yourself a warm cup of tea, and allow the worries of today to slowly drift away. Take a slow, comfortable breath. Imagine a vast frozen lake stretching to the horizon beneath a pale winter sunrise. The air is perfectly still. Snow crunches softly beneath heavy boots. In the distance, the faint sound of steel scraping across solid ice echoes through the cold morning. Horses pull enormous sledges loaded with crystal-clear blocks that sparkle like giant diamonds beneath the early light. Workers speak quietly through clouds of frosty breath, moving with practiced patience because everyone knows the harvest has only just begun. There is no electricity, no refrigeration, no easy way to preserve food once summer arrives. Everything depends on these few precious weeks of winter. Tonight, we'll follow the remarkable journey of natural ice, from silent frozen lakes to elegant Victorian basements, grand country estates, bustling city markets, hospitals, breweries, and even ships crossing entire oceans. We'll meet determined entrepreneurs, hardworking laborers, ingenious engineers, and ordinary families whose daily lives depended upon a harvest that literally melted away with time. Along the way, we'll discover how an industry built entirely on frozen water reshaped commerce, transformed cities, connected continents, and quietly changed everyday life for millions of people. And every now and then, we'll pause to appreciate the wonderfully optimistic Victorian attitude that looked at a frozen lake and collectively decided, yes, let's send dozens of horses, giant saws, and hundreds of workers out there. What could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, quite a few things. So settle in, relax, and let the steady rhythm of history carry you gently through one of the most fascinating and surprisingly peaceful industries the Victorian world ever created. Now let's begin. Picture yourself waking up on a warm July morning in Victorian England. The sun has barely climbed above the rooftops, yet the air already feels heavy. Your kitchen is warming by the minute. Fresh milk has only a short time before it begins to sour. Butter softens almost as soon as it's placed on the table. Yesterday's meat is becoming today's problem, and tomorrow's regret if it isn't cooked quickly enough. Now imagine living every single summer this way. For most of human history, people accepted that heat was simply another challenge of life. Winter could be endured with thicker clothing and roaring fires. But summer quietly worked against everyone. It spoiled food, ruined medicine, encouraged disease, and turned even the wealthiest dining rooms into uncomfortable places to linger. There was no reassuring hum from a refrigerator in the corner. No freezer stocked with neatly labeled meals. No chilled bottle of water waiting after a long walk. Cold itself was a luxury. Today, we rarely think about temperature because electricity does the thinking for us. Open a refrigerator, and a wave of cool air greets you as though it has always been there. We grumble when the ice maker takes a little too long, never stopping to consider that our ancestors would probably have regarded such complaints with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. You mean the machine makes ice whenever you ask it to? History has a wonderful way of reminding us how quickly convenience becomes invisible. Long before electric refrigeration, ice was not something you casually dropped into a drink. It was a carefully managed resource, harvested in winter, protected through spring, and treasured throughout summer. Every block represented countless hours of labor and a race against nature itself. To people of the Victorian era, a large block of crystal clear ice was more than frozen water. It was time. It was comfort. It was preservation. It was wealth. In some circumstances, it could even mean survival. The ability to keep food cool for just a few extra days changed everything. Families wasted less. Merchants transported goods farther than ever before. Fish caught near the coast could reach inland towns while still fresh. Dairy products survived journeys that once seemed impossible. Even doctors benefited. Many medical treatments of the 19th century were, admittedly, rather adventurous by modern standards. If someone suggested applying leeches while recommending fresh sea air and a mysterious herbal tonic, few eyebrows would have been raised. Yet despite medicine's occasional enthusiasm for questionable ideas, physicians understood one important truth: cold slow decay. Ice-cooled fevers preserved certain medicines, reduced swelling after injuries, and made surgery, still an uncomfortable experience despite the growing use of anesthesia, a little more manageable. Hospitals eagerly sought reliable supplies. Breweries wanted it. Hotels demanded it. Restaurants depended upon it. Grand country estates considered it essential. Even ordinary households dreamed of having enough to keep food fresh during the hottest weeks of summer. Demand seemed almost endless. Supply, however, depended entirely upon winter behaving itself. And winter, as every farmer throughout history could have explained with a tired sigh, was not especially interested in following anyone's schedule. One unusually warm season could create problems that lasted the entire year. If lakes failed to freeze deeply enough, the harvest shrank dramatically. If early spring arrived too soon, workers raced against melting ice before enormous investments literally disappeared into cold water. Entire businesses watched the weather with remarkable anxiety. Today, investors monitor stock markets. Victorian ice merchants monitored thermometers. A few degrees could determine whether fortunes were made or quietly dissolved beneath the March sunshine. Because ice had become more than nature's seasonal gift. It had become an international commodity. One of the men who understood this better than anyone was the American entrepreneur who helped transform natural ice into a global business. He looked across New England's frozen lakes and saw something few others imagined. Not frozen water, but opportunity. While most people admired a beautiful winter landscape, he saw cargo waiting to be exported. It was an astonishingly ambitious idea. Harvest ice in Massachusetts. Ship it thousands of miles across the Atlantic, or even to the Caribbean, India, and beyond. Deliver it before it melted. On paper, it sounded almost impossible. Many people laughed. Some investors refused outright. Others politely suggested that transporting frozen water through tropical climates was perhaps not the safest business plan ever conceived. Yet the skeptics underestimated two things: human ingenuity and the remarkable insulating power of sawdust. As strange as it sounds, mountains of ordinary sawdust became one of the greatest allies of the global ice trade. Packed carefully around enormous blocks of ice, it slowed melting so effectively that ships could cross oceans while losing only part of their frozen cargo. Imagine explaining that to someone today. We're protecting our valuable ice with leftover wood shavings. It sounds like the beginning of an unsuccessful experiment. Instead, it became a thriving industry. Across Britain and North America, elegant homes soon included specially designed ice houses, cool, insulated chambers often built below ground where winter's harvest could survive astonishingly long into summer. Thick stone walls, carefully engineered drainage, and generous layers of insulating material transformed these underground rooms into nature's own refrigerators. Visitors rarely saw them. The finest luxury often remained hidden beneath the estate itself. Above ground, guests admired landscaped gardens and graceful architecture. Below ground rested several tons of frozen water, quietly making the household appear effortlessly civilized. There is something wonderfully Victorian about hiding one of your greatest technological achievements in the basement. Of course, storing ice successfully required constant attention. Every unnecessary opening of the heavy doors allowed warm air inside. Every poorly fitted drain encouraged melting. Every careless worker risked losing valuable weeks of cooling. Ice demanded patience. It rewarded discipline. And it punished mistakes without the slightest hint of sympathy. Perhaps that is why so many people compared a successful ice harvest to a successful harvest of grain. Both depended upon seasons, weather, careful planning, skilled labor, and a little cooperation from nature. Only one happened to involve considerably more slipping. As we continue our journey, we'll discover how thousands of workers transformed frozen lakes into bustling winter factories, using ingenious tools, remarkable teamwork, and extraordinary endurance to harvest one of the Victorian world's most precious resources. Because before electricity quietly changed everything, the coldest days of winter were already preparing the comforts of summer. And every perfectly cut block of ice represented hope carefully carved from a frozen world. If you wanted to become an ice merchant in the Victorian era, the very first lesson was surprisingly simple. You could not rush winter. No amount of money, ambition, or carefully written business plans could persuade a lake to freeze a little faster. Investors might be eager. Customers might already be placing orders for the coming summer. Workers might be sharpening their saws in anticipation. But nature remained wonderfully unimpressed by human schedules. And so every year the waiting began. As autumn slowly faded into winter, people across northern Britain, New England, Canada, and parts of northern Europe developed an almost obsessive interest in the weather. Every frosty morning brought cautious optimism. Every unusually warm afternoon inspired quiet concern. Today, many of us check the weather to decide whether we need an umbrella. Victorian ice merchants checked the weather to determine whether they might lose an entire year's income. It was admittedly a little more stressful. The first thin layer of ice that appeared across a pond was never enough. It looked beautiful, certainly. Delicate crystals stretched across the surface like intricate lace, sparkling beneath the pale winter sun. Children admired it. Artists painted it. Poets wrote lovingly about it. Experienced ice harvesters looked at it and said, "Not yet." Thin ice was dangerous, unreliable, and completely unsuitable for harvesting. It might support a curious bird or a scattering of fresh snow, but certainly not a team of workers, heavy horses, enormous sledges, and specialized cutting equipment. Patience was everything. Night after night, the cold continued its quiet work. Each freezing evening added another thin layer. Each calm night allowed the ice to grow thicker, stronger, and more dependable. Snowfall, however, complicated matters. A heavy blanket of snow acted like insulation, slowing the freezing process beneath it. Ironically, too much snow could delay the very conditions everyone hoped for. Nature, as always, enjoyed introducing unnecessary complications. By December or January, depending on the region and the severity of the winter, experienced foremen began making careful inspections. These were not casual strolls across the ice. Every step carried meaning. Armed with long augers, essentially enormous hand drills, they bored neat holes through the frozen surface to measure its thickness. They repeated the process dozens, sometimes hundreds, of times across the lake. A single measurement meant very little. Ice could vary dramatically from one area to another. A sheltered bay might have ice more than a foot thick. A nearby spring feeding warmer water into the lake could leave dangerously thin patches hidden beneath the dusting of snow. Those hidden weak spots earned everyone's respect. Many seasoned workers could read a frozen lake almost as if it were a map. They noticed subtle changes in color, texture, and even sound. Clear blue ice usually suggested strength. Milky white sections often contained trapped air bubbles and were considered less reliable. Dark patches invited immediate suspicion. No one wanted surprises beneath their feet, especially the sort of surprise that involved suddenly finding oneself waist-deep in freezing water. The ideal harvesting ice was often between 12 and 18 inches thick enough to support tremendous weight, yet not so thick that cutting it became unnecessarily difficult. It was a delicate balance. Too thin, and the harvest became unsafe. Too thick, and workers faced exhausting days sawing through what felt like an entire geological era. Once the foremen were satisfied, word spread quickly through nearby towns and villages. The harvest was about to begin. Almost overnight, frozen lakes transformed into bustling workplaces. Blacksmiths finished sharpening long steel blades. Carpenters repaired sledges and wooden platforms. Stable hands prepared the strongest horses. Laborers gathered heavy clothing, thick leather gloves, wool, scarves, and sturdy boots fitted with iron cleats for better grip. Entire communities understood the importance of the coming weeks. The work would be difficult. The days would be brutally cold. But the opportunity was precious. For many families, seasonal employment during the ice harvest provided much-needed income during a time of year when other outdoor work slowed dramatically. Farmers whose fields lay dormant often joined the crews. Lumbermen accustomed to harsh winters found themselves well suited to the demanding conditions. Young men eager to prove themselves worked alongside seasoned veterans who seemed capable of judging ice simply by listening to the faint echoes beneath their boots. Whether that was genuine skill or an impressive display of confidence remained open to debate. Confidence, after all, has always been one of humanity's favorite survival tools. Preparations extended beyond the workers themselves. Large storage barns were inspected. Drainage systems beneath ice houses were cleared to ensure melting water could escape. Mountains of clean sawdust were delivered and carefully piled nearby, ready to insulate the precious harvest once it reached storage. It must have looked rather peculiar to an unfamiliar visitor. One group of people was desperately hoping for colder weather. Another was collecting enormous piles of wood shavings, and everyone seemed unusually excited about frozen water. Yet beneath this seemingly odd activity lay a remarkable organization. Schedules were drawn up with military precision. Teams were assigned specific tasks. Some workers would clear snow from the ice. Others would mark perfectly straight cutting lines. Horse teams would pull specialized plows. Sawyers would follow behind, separating massive blocks from the frozen surface. Transport crews would haul each glittering block toward the waiting ice houses. Nothing happened by accident. Every movement had been refined through decades of experience. Speed mattered, because although winter appeared endless while standing in a biting January wind, experienced harvesters understood its secret. Every winter ends, sometimes suddenly. A single warm week could soften the surface. Rain could weaken carefully prepared working areas. Strong sunshine reflected from the snow might begin the slow process of melting even while temperatures remained cold overnight. The race against time had already begun, even before the first block was cut. Perhaps that is what makes the story of natural ice so fascinating. Unlike coal hidden underground or timber growing patiently in forests, ice existed only briefly. It arrived with the cold, demanded immediate action, and quietly vanished if ignored. It was one of the few industries where the product itself had an expiration date before it was even harvested. That knowledge gave every winter morning a sense of urgency. As dawn broke across frozen lakes, workers stepped onto the shimmering surface knowing they had only a narrow window to secure the comfort of the coming summer. The lake had spent weeks patiently preparing its frozen treasure. Now at last, it was time for people to begin carving it free. By the time the first team stepped confidently onto the frozen lake, winter had already done most of the hard work. Now came the human part. And as with many Victorian industries, it involved an impressive amount of measuring, marking, inspecting, checking, rechecking, and occasionally staring thoughtfully into the distance while pretending that the weather might change its mind if everyone looked serious enough. Before a single block of ice could be harvested, someone had to answer one very important question. Was the ice actually good enough? Not just thick enough to stand on. Not just frozen enough to survive another cold night, but perfect enough to become a product that wealthy households, hotels, breweries, hospitals, and merchants would gladly pay for months later. The answer required experience. A great deal of experience. To an ordinary visitor, every frozen lake looked much the same. A broad white surface stretched toward the distant shoreline, glittering beneath the pale winter sun. It appeared calm, peaceful, and perfectly solid. Experienced ice foremen saw something entirely different. They saw quality. They saw weaknesses. They saw profit. And they saw danger. Years spent working on frozen lakes had taught them to notice details that escaped almost everyone else. One of the first things they examined was the color of the ice. The finest natural ice was remarkably clear. When viewed closely, it often carried a faint blue tint, almost like a piece of polished crystal. Looking through a freshly cut section, you could sometimes see several feet into the water below. This clear ice was strong, dense, and highly prized. Cloudy white ice, however, was another matter entirely. Its milky appearance usually came from countless tiny air bubbles trapped during freezing. Sometimes fresh snowfall had partially melted before refreezing, creating weak layers within the sheet. Other times, fluctuating temperatures had introduced imperfections that reduced both strength and appearance. Such ice still had its uses, but it rarely commanded the highest prices. Victorian customers appreciated beautiful ice, which sounds slightly unusual today, considering most of us immediately drop it into a drink and forget it exists about 10 minutes later. Appearance mattered, especially to wealthy clients who expected perfection in almost everything. Large country estates wanted elegant, crystal-clear blocks stored in their underground ice houses. Luxury hotels wanted attractive ice for serving chilled desserts and cooling expensive wines. Hospitals preferred the purest ice available whenever possible. A merchant's reputation could depend upon the quality of every block delivered. That reputation began here, standing on a frozen lake. The next task involved measuring thickness. This process demanded patience rather than guesswork. Workers carried long iron augers fitted with sturdy wooden handles. Pressing the sharp tip against the ice, they slowly twisted downward until the tool finally broke through into the icy water beneath. The auger emerged dripping. The measurement began. A marked rod was lowered into the opening until it touched the underside of the ice. The depth was carefully noted before the rod was withdrawn, and the hole marked for future reference. One hole proved very little. Dozens revealed the truth. Sometimes hundreds were drilled across a single harvesting site. The ice might measure 14 inches near the center of the lake, only 10 inches closer to a flowing stream, perhaps 16 inches beneath a sheltered cove protected from strong winds. Nature never guaranteed consistency. Every lake possessed its own personality. Some froze evenly. Others concealed invisible currents beneath their silent surface. Underground springs created especially troublesome conditions. Warm water rising from below slowly weakened sections of the ice, even during severe winters. From above, everything appeared perfectly ordinary, until someone stepped onto the wrong spot. Experienced foremen memorized these dangerous areas from previous seasons. Knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. Never harvest near those reeds. Avoid the eastern shoreline after heavy snowfall. Watch the creek entrance. Simple advice. Potentially life-saving advice. The weather itself left clues. Several consecutive nights of bitter cold produced dense, reliable ice. Alternating days of thawing and freezing often created layered sheets that looked solid but fractured more easily under heavy loads. Rain complicated matters even further. Strong winds sometimes swept snow away from one section while piling deep drifts elsewhere, causing uneven freezing across surprisingly short distances. Nothing escaped careful observation. Even sound became an important guide. Walking across a frozen lake produced countless noises. Some were entirely harmless. A faint creaking beneath heavy boots. Gentle pops caused by changing temperatures. Long, distant groans echoing across the ice as it expanded and contracted. These sounds unnerved newcomers. Veterans barely noticed them. It's talking, an experienced worker might say with complete calm. That's normal. Easy for him to say. After 20 winters, one probably became accustomed to standing on what sounded suspiciously like a giant piece of cracking glass. The truly dangerous sounds were different. Sharp, sudden cracks. Unexpected shifts. Unusual vibrations beneath heavy equipment. Those demanded immediate attention. No cargo of ice was worth risking dozens of lives. At least, that was the theory. History occasionally demonstrates that human optimism has always exceeded human caution. Fortunately, most large harvesting companies understood that accidents interrupted business. Healthy workers harvested far more ice than injured ones. A surprisingly practical approach to workplace safety. Once inspectors completed their survey, the chosen harvesting field was marked. This required remarkable precision. Straight lines stretched across the frozen surface using ropes, measuring poles, and wooden stakes. Workers established an enormous grid that sometimes covered several acres. Standing atop a nearby hill, the pattern resembled a giant checkerboard etched into the snow. Every future block had already been planned. Uniform size mattered enormously. Ice houses were carefully designed to accommodate standard dimensions. Transport sledges carried loads more efficiently when blocks matched one another. Ships crossing the Atlantic stacked regular blocks with fewer wasted spaces. Even customers appreciated consistency. Nobody wanted one delivery containing graceful, rectangular blocks, while the next resembled an enthusiastic sculpture project gone unexpectedly wrong. Standardization quietly transformed the industry. It reduced waste, improved storage, simplified transportation, increased profits. The Victorians adored efficient systems, and frozen lakes soon became some of the most carefully measured workplaces of their age. As the final measurements were recorded and the last inspection holes frozen over once again, anticipation spread through the crews. Everything was ready. The ice had passed every test. Weeks of waiting had finally come to an end. Tomorrow, before sunrise, the silence of the frozen lake would disappear beneath the sound of steel runners, horse hooves, shouted instructions, and giant saws biting into crystal-clear ice. The careful measuring was finished. The great harvest was about to begin. The frozen lake no longer looked peaceful. Not because winter had disappeared, but because people had arrived. Only yesterday, the ice had stretched silently toward the horizon, interrupted only by drifting snow and the occasional curious fox wandering along the shoreline. Now, before the sun had fully risen, the lake was alive with movement. Men walked in long lines across the frozen surface. Horses pulled heavy equipment through carefully marked lanes. Foremen shouted instructions that disappeared into the cold morning air. Steel scraped against ice with a rhythm that echoed for miles. What had once been a quiet piece of nature had become a temporary industrial city. And remarkably, within a few weeks, it would disappear again without leaving much behind. Every successful ice harvest depended on people. Lots of people. In the largest harvesting operations of 19th century New England, several hundred workers, and sometimes well over 1,000 during particularly busy seasons, could be employed at once. It was one of the largest seasonal industries of the Victorian world, drawing laborers from nearby farms, villages, lumber camps, and small towns. Winter had slowed many other occupations. Fields lay dormant beneath snow. Construction projects paused. River transport became difficult. But ice harvesting, that was only just beginning. For many farming families, the frozen months were not a season of complete rest. Instead, winter offered another opportunity to earn money before spring planting returned. A farmer who spent summer growing hay might spend January harvesting ice. A lumberjack accustomed to working in dense forests might exchange towering pine trees for enormous frozen lakes. A blacksmith might spend evenings sharpening hundreds of steel blades dulled by endless hours of cutting ice. Entire communities adjusted their routines around the harvest. Children often watched from nearby hills, fascinated by the enormous operation unfolding before them. Shopkeepers stocked extra food. Stable owners prepared additional horses. Local inns filled with traveling workers who would arrive hoping to find employment before the season ended. The harvest brought life to places that otherwise might have seemed almost asleep beneath the snow. And everyone understood one simple fact. Winter would not wait forever. Each worker had a specific responsibility. Some crews carried wide wooden snow scrapers, clearing fresh snowfall from the harvesting area. This might seem like an unnecessary task at first. After all, snow is frozen too. Surely it belongs on ice. Unfortunately, snow had an annoying habit of hiding important things. It concealed cracks. It disguised measuring lines. It made horses lose their footing. And perhaps most inconveniently, it prevented sunlight from revealing the quality of the ice beneath. So away it went. Hour after hour, men pushed broad scrapers across the frozen surface, exposing smooth sheets of blue-white ice that shimmered beneath the winter sky. Nearby, another crew carefully marked straight lines across the lake. These workers transformed the frozen surface into an enormous geometric grid. Every line had a purpose. Every measurement mattered. The future blocks needed to fit neatly into storage houses, railway wagons, horse-drawn sledges, and eventually the holds of ships bound for distant ports. Victorian industry adored precision. Apparently, even frozen lakes deserved proper organization. Further out on the ice stood the horse teams. Massive draft horses waited patiently beside their handlers, their thick winter coats dusted with frost. Leather harnesses creaked softly whenever they shifted their weight. Their breath rose in dense clouds that drifted lazily through the crisp air. These animals were among the strongest members of the workforce. Without them, harvesting thousands of tons of ice would have been almost impossible. They pulled specialized plows, dragged enormous sledges, moved equipment weighing far more than any group of men could manage alone. Unlike steam engines, horses required no coal, only food, water, rest, and one imagines occasional reassurance that walking across a frozen lake with several tons of equipment attached behind them was perfectly reasonable. Fortunately, horses tend not to ask too many questions. Scattered across the worksite were experienced foremen. They rarely carried the heaviest tools. Instead, they carried responsibility. They inspected the ice continuously, watching for changing weather, dangerous cracks, or signs that part of the harvesting field might be becoming unsafe. Experience had taught them never to trust a frozen lake completely. Winter was dependable. Ice was not. The weather influenced everything. If fresh snow began falling heavily, crews worked faster. If the wind strengthened, visibility could disappear within minutes. If temperatures climbed unexpectedly above freezing, everyone understood the importance of making every remaining hour count. There were no second chances, no postponed deadlines. Nature had already chosen the schedule. Human beings merely try to keep up. Despite the hard labor, there was a remarkable rhythm to the harvest. Workers settled naturally into steady routines. The scrape of shovels, the distant ringing of metal, the muffled commands exchanged between horse drivers, the slow creak of loaded sledges moving toward shore, the steady footsteps of hundreds of boots crossing solid ice. Together they formed an unlikely winter orchestra. Not loud, not chaotic, simply constant. Many laborers preferred it that way. Conversation was brief. The work demanded concentration. Besides, speaking too much in freezing air often left one's face feeling as though it belonged to someone else. Practical silence became part of the job. Yet there was still companionship. Men shared hot coffee from battered metal flasks. They exchanged quiet jokes during short breaks. Older workers advised younger ones where the safest footing could be found. If someone's gloves became soaked, another might offer a dry spare pair. On the ice, cooperation mattered more than competition. A careless mistake endangered everyone nearby. The physical demands were relentless. Hours passed in temperatures well below freezing. Hands grew numb despite thick gloves. Shoulders ached from lifting heavy tools. Legs tired from walking mile after mile across slippery surfaces. Faces reddened beneath icy winds that never seemed entirely satisfied until they had found every small gap in a person's clothing. And yet, remarkably, most workers preferred this exhausting routine to unemployment. The harvest provided reliable wages during months when opportunities were otherwise scarce. For many households, the money earned on frozen lakes helped purchase seed for spring planting, repaired homes, paid outstanding debts, or simply placed more food on the family table. Every block of ice represented income. Every successful day meant greater security. By midday, smoke from warming fires curled gently upward near temporary shelters built along the shore. Workers gathered briefly to eat simple meals: bread, salted pork, beans, cheese, perhaps an apple carefully stored since autumn. Nothing elaborate, just enough to restore strength before returning once again to the frozen field. There was little time for lingering. The daylight hours of winter were precious. As afternoon shadows slowly lengthened across the lake, the pace rarely slowed. The harvest continued with quiet determination. Thousands of workers moved together with astonishing coordination, each understanding that they were participating in something much larger than themselves. They were not merely cutting frozen water. They were preserving summer. They were protecting food months before it would be eaten. They were cooling hospitals that had not yet treated their patients. They were preparing elegant dinners that had not yet been served. They were harvesting comfort itself. And as the sun slowly dipped toward the western horizon, another sound began to dominate the frozen landscape. Not boots, not horses, not shouted commands, but the sharp, unmistakable sound of steel blades preparing to bite into the ice for the very first time. Of all the remarkable sights that visitors could witness during a Victorian ice harvest, few inspired more amazement than the horses. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast frozen lake on a bitter January morning. The wind is sharp enough to sting your cheeks. Frost clings to every tree branch. The lake stretches before you like an endless sheet of polished marble, glowing softly beneath the pale winter sun. Then, from the distant shoreline, you hear it, a slow, rhythmic sound. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It grows steadily louder. Soon, enormous draft horses emerge from the morning mist, calmly walking onto the frozen lake as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Behind them trail heavy iron plows, wooden sledges, and equipment weighing hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds. If you were seeing it for the first time, your instinct might be to shout, "Surely someone should reconsider this plan." The horses, however, had no such concerns. They simply lowered their heads, breathed great clouds of white steam into the freezing air, and continued forward with quiet determination. For the workers, these magnificent animals were far more than beasts of burden. They were partners. Without horses, the natural ice industry would never have reached the enormous scale that it eventually achieved. Human muscles alone could cut ice. Human muscles could even move individual blocks. But harvesting tens of thousands of tons before spring arrived required strength that only teams of powerful draft horses could provide. Breeds such as Percherons, Clydesdales, Belgians, and Shires became familiar sights on frozen lakes across North America and parts of Europe. Towering over many of the workers beside them, these gentle giants possessed remarkable patience as well as extraordinary power. A single horse could pull loads that would leave dozens of men exhausted. Together, matched teams transformed impossible tasks into routine work. That did not mean the work was easy. Far from it. Walking across frozen lakes demanded absolute trust. Not blind trust. Earned trust. Experienced handlers never rushed their animals onto unfamiliar ice. Before any horse stepped onto the harvesting field, inspectors had already spent days measuring thickness, identifying weak areas, and marking safe routes. Even then, caution remained constant. The horses sensed things people sometimes overlooked. Animals often paused when approaching uncertain ground. Some hesitated near unfamiliar cracks. Others became restless if strange vibrations traveled through the ice beneath their hoofs. Many experienced drivers paid close attention to those reactions. A horse's instincts had saved more than one harvesting crew from unexpected danger. There is an old saying that animals notice the world differently from people. On frozen lakes, that difference could occasionally mean the difference between a successful day's work and disaster. To help them maintain secure footing, many working horses wore specially prepared shoes fitted with small ice cocks, short projections that provided additional grip on slippery surfaces. Without them, even the strongest animal might lose its balance while pulling a heavy load. And losing one's footing on solid ice while dragging several thousand pounds of equipment was an experience nobody wished to repeat. Least of all the horse. The animals quickly settled into familiar routines. Each morning they followed the same carefully marked paths. They pulled grooving plows across the ice with slow, deliberate steps. Later they hauled sledges loaded with freshly harvested blocks toward the waiting ice houses along the shore. Hour after hour, day after day, their steady pace became part of the heartbeat of the harvest. Unlike the loud machinery that would dominate industry in the 20th century, horses brought a quieter rhythm to the work. Harnesses creaked. Leather straps shifted. Metal fittings clinked softly. Hooves struck the ice with a measured cadence that echoed gently across the frozen landscape. It was surprisingly peaceful. Well, peaceful, provided one ignored the rather significant fact that everyone was standing on a floating sheet of frozen water. The relationship between horse and driver was built over time. The skilled team understood one another almost without words. Small movements of the reins, a gentle whistle, a familiar command spoken in a calm voice. The horses responded with remarkable precision. Many drivers spent years working alongside the same animals. They knew their personalities. One horse remained calm in fierce winds. Another preferred leading the team. A third developed an unfortunate habit of stopping whenever it believed snack time had arrived. History tends to remember great inventors and wealthy businessmen. It spends far less time acknowledging the stubborn horse that refused to move until someone produced another handful of oats. Yet that horse may have contributed just as much to a successful harvest. Winter work placed tremendous demands upon the animals. Despite the freezing temperatures, pulling heavy equipment generated enormous body heat. Handlers regularly stopped to prevent exhaustion. Fresh water was offered whenever practical, though keeping water from freezing created another challenge entirely. Hay accompanied nearly every break. An ice horse consumed impressive amounts of food each day simply to maintain its strength in the bitter cold. Their welfare mattered, not only because people cared for the animals, though many certainly did, but also because replacing an experienced draft horse was expensive. Victorian businessmen occasionally discovered that compassion and financial wisdom could arrive at exactly the same conclusion. Weather remained the greatest uncertainty. Fresh snow made pulling harder. Strong winds reduced visibility. Sudden warming threatened the strength of the ice beneath every hoof. The foreman constantly watched both sky and surface. If conditions changed, routes changed with them. No load of ice justified unnecessary risk. At least that was the intention. Accidents still happened. A horse might stumble while climbing onto a loaded sledge. Harnesses occasionally snapped beneath enormous strain. Thin sections of ice sometimes cracked unexpectedly under concentrated weight. Most incidents ended with frightened animals, soaked boots, and a great many relieved sighs. Others ended far more tragically. Whenever a horse broke through the ice, rescue became an immediate priority. Workers rushed forward carrying ropes, wooden planks, and whatever equipment lay nearest. Saving the animal demanded speed. Freezing water drained strength with terrifying efficiency. Sometimes the rescue succeeded. The exhausted horse was hauled back onto solid ice, wrapped in blankets, rubbed vigorously to restore circulation, and given time to recover. Those moments were greeted with genuine celebration. Not because work could continue, because a trusted companion had survived. Unfortunately, not every story ended so happily. The lakes demanded respect. They accepted no arguments. Even the most experienced crews understood that nature always possessed the final word. Yet despite these dangers, the horses returned every morning. Patient, reliable, steady. They asked for no applause. They expected no recognition. They simply walked across the frozen world, pulling the tools that made one of history's most remarkable seasonal industries possible. By the end of each day, the carefully marked harvesting field bore long parallel grooves stretching toward the horizon. The horses had completed the first stage of the harvest. Now it was time for the men with the great steel saws to follow those frozen lines, cutting deep into the crystal-clear ice until enormous blocks began separating from the lake itself. By now, the frozen lake no longer resembled a quiet piece of wilderness. It looked more like an enormous workshop built by winter itself. Long, perfectly straight grooves stretched across the ice in every direction. Teams of horses had already completed their careful work, carving neat parallel lines that divided the lake into what appeared to be an endless checkerboard. Everything was ready for the next stage. Now came the sawyers. If the horses supplied the strength, these men supplied the precision. One by one, workers walked onto the marked field, carrying enormous ice saws balanced across their shoulders. To modern eyes, they looked strangely oversized, far larger than the ordinary woodworking saws hanging in Victorian barns. Some measured 6 feet in length. Others were even longer. Their thick steel blades shimmered faintly beneath the pale winter sunlight, each lined with coarse, razor-sharp teeth designed for one purpose alone: to cut through solid ice. It was a surprisingly elegant piece of engineering. Unlike a carpenter's saw, which removed wood fibers with every stroke, an ice saw sliced through frozen water with remarkable efficiency. The teeth were spaced widely apart, allowing tiny shards of ice to escape without clogging the blade. Simple, practical, beautifully effective. The Victorians had an extraordinary talent for improving ordinary tools. Give them a problem, and they would almost certainly invent a specialized device for solving it. Sometimes that invention involved gears, sometimes steam, sometimes an alarming quantity of cast iron. In this case, however, they discovered that a well-designed saw was more than enough. The first cuts demanded careful concentration. 2 experienced sawyers positioned themselves over one of the grooves left behind by the horse-drawn plows. They lowered the long blade into the narrow channel. For a brief moment, everything became still. Then they began. Forward, back, forward, back. The rhythm was slow and deliberate. There was no rushing. The blade glided through the frozen groove with a soft scraping sound that echoed gently across the lake. Tiny crystals sprayed into the air, sparkling like powdered diamonds before settling quietly back onto the snow. Within minutes, the shallow groove deepened noticeably. Every stroke carried the blade farther toward the dark water, hidden beneath. Watching skilled sawyers at work could almost feel hypnotic. Their movements became perfectly synchronized. Neither man fought against the other. Instead, each allowed the saw to perform its own quiet work. Push, pull, push, pull, again, again, again. It was less a display of brute strength than one of patience. Many newcomers assumed the work depended upon power alone. Experienced harvesters knew better. Too much force caused the blade to bind. Too little accomplished almost nothing. Finding the perfect rhythm required practice that often took several seasons to master. Older workers recognized good sawyers almost immediately, not because they moved faster, because they moved more smoothly. Every motion appeared effortless. Of course, appearances can be wonderfully misleading. By the end of a long winter day, even the strongest sawyer felt the strain in aching shoulders, stiff backs, and frozen fingers. Hours of repetitive movement gradually exhausted every muscle. The bitter cold offered little sympathy. Metal tool handles became painfully cold to hold despite thick leather gloves. Moisture from melting ice soaked sleeves and boots. Every exhaled breath drifted upward as a cloud of white vapor before disappearing into the winter sky. Still, the work continued. Around them, dozens of other crews repeated exactly the same process. From a nearby hillside, the entire operation looked astonishingly organized. Long rows of workers bent over their saws in perfect sequence. Steel blades flashed rhythmically beneath the sunlight. The sounds blended into a steady chorus. Scrape, slide, scrape, slide. It was not loud, not chaotic. Instead, it possessed an almost peaceful regularity. Nature and industry working together. Victorian engineers admired systems that combined order with efficiency. Ice harvesting offered both. Once the long cuts had reached the proper depth, another specialized tool entered the scene. The ice chisel. At first glance, it resembled an oversized iron spear attached to a sturdy wooden handle. Workers drove its sharp edge into the remaining thin layer, connecting the block to the surrounding sheet of ice. One strike, then another. Soon, a faint crack spread quietly beneath the surface. Not the frightening crack that made everyone stop working. The satisfying one. The kind that announced another perfectly measured block was almost free. With a final careful push, the enormous rectangle separated from the lake. For the first time since winter had begun, that section of ice floated independently upon the dark water below. It was an oddly beautiful moment. A block that had rested silently beneath snow for months was now beginning a journey that might end hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Perhaps beneath the elegant dining room of a London townhouse. Perhaps inside a brewery in Boston. Perhaps cooling medicines in a hospital. Or perhaps crossing the Atlantic in the cargo hold of a sailing ship. Its destination remained unknown. Its journey had only just begun. Victorian engineering extended beyond the tools themselves. The entire harvesting process followed carefully planned sequences. No crew worked randomly. Every cut connected to another. Every floating block followed a predetermined route toward open channels that would eventually carry it to shore. It resembled an enormous puzzle assembled piece by piece. Planning reduced wasted effort. Reduced wasted effort meant greater profits. The Victorians appreciated profitable ideas almost as much as they appreciated afternoon tea, sometimes perhaps even more. Foremen moved constantly among the crews, inspecting the quality of each cut. A poorly aligned groove could create uneven blocks that proved difficult to transport or stack. Small mistakes multiplied quickly. One crooked cut might interfere with dozens of blocks farther down the line. Precision remained essential from beginning to end. Even the saws themselves required constant attention. As the day progressed, steel teeth gradually lost their sharpness. Tiny imperfections developed along the cutting edge. At regular intervals, blacksmiths stationed near the shoreline collected worn blades for sharpening. Soon they returned, gleaming once again and ready for another day's work. Nothing was wasted. Every tool represented valuable investment. Maintenance was simply part of the industry. By late afternoon, the frozen lake had changed dramatically. Where solid ice had stretched uninterrupted that morning, neat rows of floating blocks now rested within carefully cut channels. Sunlight reflected brilliantly from their crystal-clear surfaces. Each one weighed hundreds of pounds. Each one had been shaped with remarkable accuracy. Each one represented another small victory over winter's brief timetable. The sawyers finally rested, wiping frost from their beards and stretching tired muscles while the last light of day painted the snowy landscape in soft shades of gold and blue. Tomorrow, another team would take over. Their task would be no less remarkable. They would guide these massive floating blocks through narrow channels toward the shore, where conveyor systems, horse-drawn sledges, towering ice houses waited patiently to receive nature's frozen harvest. Why now, the frozen lake had become a masterpiece of careful planning. Long, straight channels stretched across the shimmering surface like the neatly ruled pages of an enormous notebook. Every line had been measured. Every groove had been cut with remarkable precision. The giant saws had already done their demanding work, carving deep into the crystal-clear ice until thousands of enormous rectangles lay, almost ready to break free. Now came one of the most satisfying moments of the entire harvest, turning one vast sheet of winter into thousands of perfectly shaped blocks. At first glance, it looked surprisingly simple. After all, the grooves were already there. Surely the workers only needed to separate the blocks from one another. If only history were ever that cooperative. The final cuts demanded even greater care than the earlier stages. Every block had to match its neighbors as closely as possible. Too large, and it might not fit onto a transport sledge or inside an ice house. Too small, and valuable storage space would be wasted. In an industry where thousands upon thousands of blocks might pass through a single harvest season, even a difference of an inch or two mattered. Victorian merchants adored consistency. Customers did too. One experienced foreman liked to say that every block should look as though it had been made by the same pair of hands. It was a difficult standard to achieve. Yet many crews managed it with astonishing skill. The workers began by widening the deep grooves already scored into the lake. Standing carefully on narrow strips of solid ice between the channels, they guided long saws through the remaining frozen connections. Their movements had become almost automatic after weeks of practice. Push, pull, push, pull. Tiny crystals of ice drifted into the air like sparkling dust. The sound was steady, almost musical. Not loud enough to disturb the stillness of winter, yet constant enough to remind everyone that hundreds of people were working together across the frozen landscape. Nearby, another crew followed with heavy iron chisels. These tools looked simple, little more than sturdy steel wedges attached to thick wooden handles, but they required remarkable skill to use properly. The workers positioned the chisel precisely along the final frozen seam. One sharp strike, then another, sometimes a third. A faint crack spread quietly beneath the surface. It was a beautiful sound, not frightening, not violent, just a gentle reminder that the ice understood exactly where it had been asked to separate. Then, almost magically, the enormous block lifted ever so slightly. The dark water beneath accepted it with barely a ripple. For the first time in months, that piece of ice was no longer part of the lake. It had become cargo. Watching hundreds of these blocks break free was oddly mesmerizing. One after another, they floated gently within the narrow channels that workers had prepared. Their sides were smooth. Their corners were sharp. Their surfaces reflected the pale winter sun with remarkable clarity. Some visitors later described the site as resembling an enormous city built entirely from crystal. Others compared it to giant glass bricks drifting quietly across black water. Both descriptions came surprisingly close. Each block often measured around 22 by 32 inches, though dimensions varied depending on the harvesting company and intended use. Thickness usually ranged between 12 and 18 inches, the result of weeks of patient waiting for exactly the right freezing conditions. A single block commonly weighed between 300 and 500 pounds. Looking at them floating peacefully beside one another, it was easy to forget their tremendous weight. Ice has a curious habit of appearing lighter than it truly is. Perhaps because it sparkles. Or perhaps because floating things seem less intimidating. Try lifting one, however, and the illusion disappears rather quickly. Despite their size, the blocks moved surprisingly easily once they were free. Water carried much of their weight. Workers armed with long wooden pike poles guided them through the channels using little more than gentle pressure. It was almost graceful. A small push, a slight turn, another careful adjustment. The giant blocks glided forward as though they had decided to cooperate after all. Experienced workers became remarkably skilled at steering them. With nothing more than a long pole tipped with an iron hook, a man could rotate a 400-pound block exactly where he wanted it to go. Watching such effortless control was genuinely impressive. Newcomers, by contrast, often discovered that frozen water possessed a stubborn personality of its own. Pushed too hard, and the block spun unexpectedly. Pushed too softly, and it refused to move at all. The ice seemed determined to reward patience while gently embarrassing anyone in a hurry. There was, perhaps, a quiet lesson hidden there. Throughout the harvesting field, the floating blocks gathered into orderly rows. No frantic shouting echoed across the lake. No chaotic scrambling interrupted the work. Instead, every crew followed the same carefully practiced routine. Separate, guide, align, repeat, hour after hour. The efficiency was remarkable. It had taken decades of experience to perfect this system. Earlier generations of harvesters had experimented with different tools, different cutting methods, and different ways of organizing the work. Gradually, Each season taught valuable lessons. Small improvements accumulated year after year until the process became one of the most efficient examples of seasonal labor in the 19th century. Innovation did not always require complicated machinery. Sometimes it required thousands of ordinary people quietly discovering better ways to perform ordinary tasks. Even the weather continued to influence every decision. Bright sunshine reflected brilliantly from the white surface, making many workers squint despite the cold. Wind occasionally swept loose snow across the channels, obscuring carefully marked paths. Temperatures remained comfortably below freezing for the moment. No one forgot that word. For the moment. Every successful harvest depended upon winter lasting just a little longer. As afternoon approached, the network of floating channels became increasingly crowded with finished blocks. From the shoreline, the lake resembled a giant mosaic of sparkling rectangles stretching almost to the horizon. Each one represented hours of careful planning, days of preparation, weeks of freezing temperatures, months of future comfort waiting quietly beneath the ice houses that had yet to receive them. The workers paused only briefly for food and warm drinks before returning once more to the frozen grid. There was satisfaction in seeing neat rows of perfectly cut blocks drifting patiently toward their next destination. The hardest cutting was finished. But the journey had only begun, because cutting the ice was merely the first half of the harvest. Now came the challenge of moving thousands of heavy blocks from the middle of a frozen lake to enormous storage houses on the shore, without damaging them, losing them, or accidentally sending anyone for an unexpected swim in water cold enough to inspire immediate regret. With the cutting finally complete, the frozen lake entered a new phase. The giant saws grew quieter. The rhythmic scraping that had echoed across the ice for days slowly faded into the background. Now the lake itself seemed to come alive. Thousands of perfectly cut blocks floated gently in long, narrow channels of dark water, rocking ever so slightly beneath the pale winter sky. They no longer belonged to the frozen sheet that had held them captive for months. They were free. Not free to wander, of course. Victorian foremen were very particular about that sort of thing. Every block had a destination. Every channel had a purpose. And every worker knew exactly where those glittering rectangles were supposed to go. From above, the harvesting field looked almost like a carefully designed canal system. Straight waterways stretched across the lake, intersecting at precise angles before gradually narrowing into larger collection channels that led toward the shoreline. It was a remarkable piece of temporary engineering. Within a few weeks, the entire system would vanish beneath melting ice, leaving almost no trace that thousands of tons of frozen water had ever passed through it. History has a curious habit of allowing some of its greatest industries to disappear without leaving much evidence behind. The workers responsible for guiding the harvest carried surprisingly simple tools. Most held long wooden pike poles, often 10 or 12 feet in length, tipped with sturdy iron hooks. At first glance, the poles looked almost too modest for such an enormous task. How, you might wonder, could one man control a block of ice weighing several hundred pounds with nothing more than a long stick? The answer lay in understanding water. Once the ice floated freely, the lake carried nearly all of its weight. Instead of lifting the block, workers merely guided it. A gentle push against one corner, a slight pull with the iron hook, another careful adjustment. The enormous block responded almost effortlessly, gliding through the narrow channel with graceful precision. Watching experienced crews at work could feel strangely hypnotic. Hundreds of blocks drifted slowly toward shore in perfectly organized lines, each one following the block ahead like silent passengers in an icy parade. There was no rushing, no frantic shouting, only steady movement. Push, glide, turn, continue. Again, again, again. The pace suited the work perfectly. After all, the blocks themselves were in no hurry. They had spent months frozen in place. A few more hours hardly seemed worth complaining about. Of course, Ice occasionally displayed a stubborn personality. Two blocks might wedge themselves together at an awkward angle. A corner could catch against the side of a channel. Several floating pieces might drift slightly out of alignment, slowing everything behind them. When that happened, experienced workers stepped forward calmly. There was rarely any panic. One man nudged a corner. Another eased a neighboring block backward. A third adjusted the flow from behind. Within moments, the miniature traffic jam disappeared. One suspects modern city drivers could have learned a great deal from Victorian ice harvesters. Patience solved problems surprisingly well. As the channels grew busier, communication became increasingly important. Foremen stood at key intersections, directing the movement of hundreds of floating blocks much like conductors leading an orchestra. Short commands echoed across the lake. Ease it forward. Hold that line. Open the channel. The instructions were brief, clear, and familiar. Most crews had worked together for several winters. Little explanation was needed. Experience spoke for itself. The weather remained an ever-present companion. Bright sunlight reflected brilliantly from the crystal-clear ice, forcing many workers to shade their eyes beneath wool caps. The cold air felt sharp but strangely refreshing after hours of physical labor. Occasionally, a light breeze swept across the lake, sending loose snow dancing over the frozen surface like tiny ghosts. Beautiful to watch. Slightly less beautiful when it blew directly into one's face. Winter possessed a subtle sense of humor. As the floating harvest approached the shoreline, another marvel of Victorian engineering came into view. Wooden guideways extended from the edge of the lake into the water, carefully designed to funnel the drifting blocks toward narrow receiving channels. Nothing was left to chance. The guideways ensured that each block arrived in exactly the right position for the next stage of its journey. Workers stationed along these channels used their pike poles with astonishing precision. Without wasting a movement, they rotated each block until it aligned perfectly with the loading equipment waiting nearby. The operation resembled an enormous assembly line, except the conveyor belt happened to be a frozen lake. Nearby, horse teams waited patiently beside massive wooden structures that rose above the shoreline. Endless chain conveyors, powered by horses, water wheels, or later by small steam engines in some locations, stood ready to lift the heavy blocks out of the lake. The workers smiled quietly as another block reached the loading point. One more safely delivered. Thousands still to come. Every successful arrival represented another small victory over winter's relentless timetable. Not every block completed the journey without incident. Occasionally, one drifted sideways and became trapped. Sometimes a sharp corner chipped away after striking another block too firmly. A few cracked unexpectedly, because of hidden flaws deep within the ice. Those damaged pieces were rarely discarded. Smaller fragments still cooled food, still chilled drinks, still served useful purposes. Victorian businesses disliked waste almost as much as they disliked warm butter. Nothing valuable was thrown away unnecessarily. By late afternoon, the shoreline had become the busiest place on the entire lake. Long lines of floating crystals stretched toward the loading platforms. Workers moved continuously from one task to another. Hooks lifted, poles pushed, commands echoed softly. Harnesses jingled as horses shifted patiently in the snow. Above everything rose the quiet rumble of machinery, preparing to lift nature's frozen harvest from water to land. As the sun drifted lower in the western sky, its golden light reflected from thousands of glittering ice blocks until the lake seemed to shine like a field of scattered diamonds. It was breathtaking, temporary, and entirely practical. Tomorrow, many of those sparkling blocks would disappear into enormous underground ice houses, where careful engineering would preserve them through spring, summer, and often well into autumn. For now, however, they floated peacefully at the edge of the lake, waiting for the next remarkable step in their journey. When people picture the Victorian ice harvest, they usually imagine strong men swinging enormous saws across frozen lakes while powerful horses haul glittering blocks toward the shore. It is an impressive image. It is also an incomplete one. The natural ice industry did not belong only to the men standing on the frozen lakes. It belonged to entire communities. Behind every successful harvest stood hundreds of people whose work was quieter, less visible, and rarely celebrated in newspapers or business records. Women, children, shopkeepers, craftsmen, cooks, stable workers, and countless others formed the invisible foundation of an industry that depended on far more than muscle alone. History often remembers the people holding the biggest tools. It sometimes forgets everyone who made those tools useful. As dawn broke over the frozen lakes each morning, many women were already awake. Long before the first saw bit into the ice, kitchen fires had been lit. Bread baked the previous day was sliced for packed meals. Large pots of porridge simmered slowly over iron stoves. Coffee and tea were prepared in quantities that seemed almost endless. Feeding hundreds of hungry laborers required remarkable organization. A man swinging an ice saw for 10 hours could easily consume several thousand calories in a single day. The freezing air demanded constant energy. Without enough food, exhaustion arrived quickly. Without hot drinks, morale often followed. Simple meals became surprisingly important. Thick slices of bread, salted pork, stew, beans, cheese, pickled vegetables preserved from autumn, apple pies baked from carefully stored fruit. Nothing extravagant, just nourishing food prepared with skill and consistency. Many wives, mothers, daughters, and sisters quietly supported the harvest from nearby homes, boarding houses, and temporary field kitchens established close to the lakeshore. Their work rarely appeared in company ledgers, yet without it, the harvest would have slowed considerably. Warm meals restored tired workers. Dry clothing prevented illness. Freshly mended gloves allowed another day's labor. The rhythm of the household became closely tied to the rhythm of the ice harvest. Laundry was another never-ending task. Heavy wool coats returned each evening stiff with frozen moisture. Gloves soaked through after hours of handling ice. Scarves collected frost. Boot liners needed drying before dawn. Entire rooms filled with damp clothing hanging near fireplaces. By morning, everything had to be ready once again. Winter offered little sympathy for unfinished chores. Children, too, experienced the harvest in countless ways. Older boys sometimes found seasonal work around the ice houses, performing lighter tasks suitable for their age. They swept storage floors, carried tools, delivered messages between work crews, or helped stack insulating sawdust around newly stored blocks. The work was demanding but offered valuable experience and a welcome contribution to the family's income. Younger children usually remained safely away from the active harvesting areas. At least, that was the intention. Like children in every century, curiosity occasionally proved stronger than common sense. The enormous frozen lakes, busy horse teams, and towering piles of crystal-clear ice were simply too fascinating to ignore. Parents frequently reminded them to stay well back from the channels. Some reminders undoubtedly had to be repeated several times, every day. A frozen lake filled with hundreds of workers was no place for adventurous games. Still, children watched with wide-eyed amazement from nearby hillsides. To them, the harvest looked almost magical. Great blocks of sparkling ice seemed to glide across the water by themselves. Massive horses pulled strange machines unlike anything seen during the rest of the year. Men disappeared into enormous ice houses, carrying winter inside. It must have felt like witnessing a giant seasonal performance staged exclusively for the neighborhood. Many remembered those scenes for the rest of their lives. Beyond the families directly involved, the local economy began to revolve around harvest. Blacksmiths sharpened saws almost continuously. Wheelwrights repaired sledges damaged by heavy loads. Carpenters built replacement handles for worn tools. Rope makers supplied fresh lines. General stores sold extra wool socks, mittens, lantern oil, and thick clothing. Even local bakers increased production to feed the growing workforce. The harvest created business for nearly everyone. Small inns and boarding houses experienced one of their busiest periods of the year. Traveling workers needed somewhere to sleep. Foremen held meetings over hearty evening meals. Merchants visited to negotiate contracts. Common rooms buzzed with quiet conversation as tired laborers warmed themselves beside roaring fires before another early start. If winter usually meant slower business, the ice harvest changed everything. Some innkeepers looked forward to freezing weather almost as eagerly as the ice merchants themselves. There was another side to this seasonal prosperity. Not every family experienced comfort. Victorian life remained difficult for many working people. A poor harvest, an illness, or a workplace injury could quickly place a household in serious financial trouble. Seasonal wages helped, but they did not eliminate hardship. Many families balanced carefully between stability and uncertainty. A few weeks of paid employment might determine whether debts could be settled before spring. In that sense, every block of ice represented more than future cooling. It represented opportunity. For children, the harvest also became an education. Long before formal business schools existed, they watched commerce unfold before their eyes. They observed teamwork, planning, engineering, transportation, negotiation, Responsibility. Many boys who delivered lunches or swept ice houses during one winter eventually became foremen, merchants, or company owners years later. The industry quietly trained its next generation. Young girls often learned equally valuable skills by helping manage busy households during the demanding season, organizing supplies, preserving food, sewing heavy clothing, and assisting with the countless practical tasks that kept families functioning through the long winter months. Their contributions were less visible, but no less essential. History has not always recorded their names. That does not make their work any less real. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of the ice economy was how deeply it connected an entire community. The man cutting blocks on the lake depended upon the blacksmith who sharpened his saw. The blacksmith depended upon the carpenter repairing tool handles. The carpenter relied on the stable owner caring for the horses. The stable owner bought bread from the village baker. The baker purchased flour from local farmers. And those farmers often worked on the ice harvest themselves during the winter. It was an intricate web of cooperation. No single person could claim credit for a successful season. Everyone contributed something. As evening settled over the frozen landscape, workers slowly returned home beneath skies filled with pale stars. Children greeted tired fathers at the door. Warm meals waited on sturdy wooden tables. Wet boots stood drying near the fire. Outside, the temperature continued to fall, silently adding another thin layer of ice to the lake. Tomorrow would bring another day's work, another day's wages, another step toward preserving winter for the coming summer. And while the workers rested, another extraordinary part of the story awaited. Because the ice now arriving at the shore needed somewhere to survive the warm months ahead. After days of cutting, guiding, lifting, and hauling, the frozen harvest finally reached its destination. Not a marketplace, not a grand palace, not even the kitchens where it would eventually prove so valuable. Instead, much of the Victorian world's precious ice disappeared underground. If you had wandered through the grounds of a wealthy country estate during the middle of summer, you probably would never have guessed that several tons of winter were quietly sleeping beneath your feet. The lawns looked immaculate. Flower gardens bloomed with carefully arranged colors. Tall oak trees cast gentle shade across winding paths. Guests strolled peacefully through the gardens, admiring elegant fountains and neatly trimmed hedges. Everything suggested warmth, comfort, and refinement. Hidden beneath all of it was a giant underground refrigerator. Without electricity, without motors, without compressors, simply the patient application of physics. The Victorian ice house was one of the cleverest buildings of its age. At first glance, many of them hardly looked like buildings at all. Some resembled small stone cottages tucked discreetly among trees. Others appeared as grassy mounds rising gently from the landscape, almost like tiny artificial hills. A few were hidden inside wooded areas where visitors rarely ventured. Their modest appearance was intentional. An ice house was not meant to attract attention. Its purpose was to keep something cold. And sunlight, unfortunately, was rather unhelpful in that regard. Most ice houses were built partially or entirely below ground. The earth itself became the first layer of insulation. Even on the hottest July afternoon, the temperature several feet beneath the surface remained surprisingly stable. Victorian builders understood this long before anyone spoke about thermal efficiency. They may not have used modern scientific terminology, but they certainly understood results. The walls were usually constructed from thick stone or brick. Some measured several feet in thickness. These massive walls absorb heat very slowly, protecting the precious ice stored inside. Many structures were circular rather than square. The shape distributed pressure evenly and reduced weak points where warmth might creep inside. It also happened to be remarkably elegant. Victorians appreciated buildings that were both practical and attractive. Sometimes even their storage sheds possessed architectural dignity. Entering an ice house required passing through a heavy wooden door fitted tightly against the stone frame. Some larger examples included two doors separated by a short passage. The first door blocked warm outside air. The second guarded the ice chamber itself. It was a simple airlock centuries before the concept became familiar elsewhere. Every unnecessary opening wasted cold air. Every careful closing preserved it. Inside, the temperature changed immediately. Even during midsummer, stepping into a well-built ice house felt like entering another season entirely. The air became cool, still, slightly damp. The outside world seemed to disappear. Light filtered weakly through the doorway before fading into gentle darkness. Rows upon rows of enormous ice blocks rested quietly within the chamber, each one carefully stacked by skilled workers during the winter harvest. They resembled giant transparent bricks arranged with almost military precision. There was a method behind every stack. Workers never simply piled the blocks wherever space happened to be available. Small gaps allowed cold air to circulate. Drainage channels beneath the floor carried away meltwater. If water collected around the ice, it accelerated melting. Removing it actually helped preserve the remaining blocks. It seems wonderfully unfair. To save ice, you first had to remove its own melted water. Nature enjoys little paradoxes like that. Perhaps the most surprising ingredient inside every successful ice house was not stone, not brick, not timber. Mountains of it. Fresh, clean sawdust surrounded the blocks on every side. Packed tightly between layers, it formed an extraordinary insulating blanket. To modern ears, protecting frozen water with wood shaving sounds almost ridiculous. Yet sawdust performed beautifully. Tiny pockets of trapped air inside the material slowed the movement of heat. The ice melted far more slowly than anyone unfamiliar with the system might expect. Some estates preserved ice well into late autumn. Others retained usable supplies until the following winter. An entire summer cooled by one successful harvest. Quite an achievement for little more than frozen water and leftover scraps from a sawmill. Loading an ice house was an exhausting task. The enormous blocks arrived continuously from the lake. Workers guided them onto wooden ramps or mechanical conveyors powered by horses or small steam engines. Inside the chamber, teams arranged each block with remarkable care. Hooks gripped the slippery surfaces. Ropes steadied heavy loads. Commands echoed softly against the stone walls. Easy now. A little farther. Hold it there. Every movement required coordination. A single block could weigh 400 pounds or more. Dropping one rarely improved anyone's afternoon. Nor did it improve the block. The largest country estates often owned impressive ice houses capable of storing many hundreds of tons. Such supplies allowed wealthy households to enjoy chilled drinks, fresh cream, frozen desserts, and preserved meat long after winter had disappeared. Guests attending elegant summer dinners probably admired the cool wine or refreshing fruit without giving much thought to the remarkable engineering hidden beneath the garden. Luxury often prefers to remain invisible. The servants, however, knew exactly where that luxury came from. Throughout the warm months, members of the household staff visited the ice house every day. They carefully removed only the amount required for immediate use. Large blocks were wrapped in cloth or straw before being transported to kitchens, dairies, or pantries. Nothing was wasted. Every pound mattered. The head cook might request additional ice before an important banquet. The butler might reserve several blocks for cooling expensive wines. The dairy maid depended upon steady temperatures to preserve milk and butter. The gardener occasionally borrowed smaller pieces to protect delicate plants during unexpected late frosts. One frozen harvest quietly served dozens of purposes. Hospitals built their own versions. Breweries constructed even larger ones. Hotels invested heavily in reliable storage. Railway companies developed enormous commercial ice houses beside busy transport routes. Entire cities slowly built underground networks of winter, hidden beneath streets and warehouses. Even smaller households occasionally maintained modest private ice pits. These lacked the grandeur of aristocratic estates, but relied upon exactly the same principles. Keep heat out. Remove meltwater. Insulate generously. Open the door as little as possible. Simple ideas. Remarkable results. Perhaps that is why Victorian ice houses remain so fascinating today. They remind us that brilliant engineering does not always require electricity or complicated machines. Sometimes it requires careful observation, patience, an understanding of nature, and a willingness to bury several hundred tons of frozen water beneath a perfectly respectable English lawn. Quite possibly the most elegant basement anyone ever built. As summer slowly approached, those hidden chambers became increasingly important. Every carefully stored block represented comfort waiting patiently in the darkness. Meals remained fresh. Medicine stayed cool. Grand dinners impressed important guests. Breweries continued producing crisp beer despite the rising temperatures outside. The quiet success of the entire harvest now depended upon these remarkable underground buildings. By the time June arrived, the frozen lakes that had echoed with the sounds of saws, horses, and hardworking crews had transformed completely. The thick sheets of winter ice were gone. Wildflowers now lined the shores. Fishing boats drifted lazily across open water. Children skipped stones where, only a few months earlier, hundreds of men had been harvesting enormous blocks of crystal clear ice. To anyone visiting the lake for the first time, there is almost no sign that one of the Victorian world's busiest seasonal industries had ever existed there. But winter had not disappeared. Not entirely. It had simply moved underground. Deep beneath elegant country estates, busy hotels, breweries, hospitals, and prosperous townhouses, thousands of carefully stacked blocks waited patiently inside cool, dark ice houses. Now, at last, they would begin earning their keep. For people living before electricity, summer was always something of a negotiation. The warm weather brought long days, green fields, and abundant harvests. It also brought spoiled food, unpleasant smells, sour milk, melting butter, and a constant race against time. Without refrigeration, nearly everything fresh had an invisible countdown. A roast prepared in the morning needed to be eaten quickly. Fresh fish demanded immediate attention. Cream spoiled with remarkable enthusiasm. And milk. Well, milk possessed an almost magical ability to choose the hottest afternoon imaginable before deciding that it no longer wished to remain milk. Ice changed that. Not forever. Not perfectly. But enough to transform daily life. Each morning, servants descended into the cool darkness of the estate's ice house carrying thick leather gloves, iron tongs, and sturdy baskets lined with straw. The heavy wooden door groaned open. A wave of wonderfully cold air drifted upward. Even in the middle of July, stepping inside felt like walking backward into January. The servants selected only the amount of ice needed for that day. Opening the chamber too often allowed precious warmth to enter. Closing the door quickly became second nature. Every unnecessary moment cost a little more winter. The blocks were carried carefully to kitchens, pantries, dairies, and wine cellars. Sometimes they were wrapped in cloth, sometimes packed in straw, always handled with care. Every pound represented weeks of labor on frozen lakes many months before. In the kitchen, the cook immediately put the ice to work. Fresh cream rested inside shallow metal containers surrounded by smaller chunks of crushed ice. Butter remained firm instead of dissolving into an unfortunate yellow puddle. Delicate desserts held their shape long enough to impress dinner guests. Cold fruit became a luxurious treat during hot afternoons. It is difficult to overstate just how extraordinary that felt. Today, chilled strawberries seem perfectly ordinary. To a Victorian family enjoying them in August, they represented planning, engineering, transportation, and the successful harvest of an entire winter. Luxury often arrives disguised as convenience. Perhaps nowhere was ice more appreciated than in the dairy. Milk, cheese, and cream were notoriously difficult to preserve once temperatures began climbing. A cool dairy room lined with stone floors and supplied with fresh ice could extend the life of these products by several precious days. Those extra days mattered enormously. They reduced waste, protected income, improved public health, allowed food to travel farther than ever before. For farmers and merchants alike, ice quietly expanded opportunity. The butcher valued it just as highly. Fresh meat spoiled quickly during warm weather. Before reliable refrigeration, preserving meat often meant salting, smoking, or drying it. Those methods worked well enough, but they also changed the flavor. Ice allowed butchers to keep meat fresh without altering its character. Customers noticed the difference. Business improved. The fishmongers perhaps appreciated winter's harvest even more. Imagine trying to transport freshly caught fish dozens of miles inland during a heat wave. Without cooling, the journey quickly became a race against nature. Packed between layers of crushed ice, however, the same catch could arrive fresh enough to command excellent prices. Entire inland. Markets suddenly gained access to seafood that previously would have spoiled long before reaching them. It was nothing short of revolutionary. Breweries depended upon ice almost obsessively. Many traditional brewing processes required cool, stable temperatures. During hot summers, maintaining those conditions became nearly impossible without large supplies of natural ice. Workers packed fermentation rooms with enormous blocks harvested months earlier. The cold air slowed unwanted bacterial growth and helped produce cleaner, more consistent beer. One might say that Victorian brewers loved ice nearly as much as their customers loved beer, quite possibly more. Hospitals also relied heavily upon the frozen harvest. Doctors used ice to reduce high fevers, soothe inflammation, and preserve certain medicines. In an era before antibiotics and modern refrigeration, every advantage mattered. Surgeons sometimes requested ice before difficult operations. Nurses wrapped cloth around small pieces to create cooling compresses for injured patients. Simple by today's standards, remarkably valuable at the time. The wealthy naturally discovered additional uses. Elegant dinner parties featured chilled wines and sparkling desserts. Silver bowls filled with crushed ice held fresh oysters. Fruit remained cool throughout lengthy banquets. Guests admired what appeared to be effortless hospitality. Few paused to consider the extraordinary journey each piece of ice had taken, from a frozen lake hundreds of miles away to a crystal bowl resting beneath candlelight. Comfort has always hidden an astonishing amount of work. Even ordinary households that cannot afford private ice houses sometimes purchase small quantities from local ice dealers. The neighborhood ice wagon became a familiar sight in many growing towns. Its driver traveled slowly along dusty streets beneath the summer sun. Behind him rested enormous insulated compartments packed tightly with ice. Children often watched eagerly from windows, hoping to receive a tiny chipped fragment on especially hot afternoons. Many drivers obliged. It was a simple kindness. One imagines they also enjoyed becoming the most popular person in the neighborhood for a few minutes. As summer stretched onward, everyone monitored the remaining supply. Ice houses gradually emptied. Blocks became smaller. The once towering stacks slowly diminished. Estate managers calculated carefully. Would the harvest last until autumn? Had enough been stored during the winter? Could smaller portions extend the supply for another month? Every warm day posed the same quiet question. How much winter remained? Fortunately, well-designed ice houses often exceeded expectations. Thanks to thick stone walls, underground construction, excellent drainage, and generous layers of sawdust, many retained usable ice astonishingly late into the year. Visitors entering an ice house in September sometimes found themselves shivering despite the lingering warmth outside. The building had quietly defeated summer, at least for a little while longer. There is something wonderfully poetic about that. An entire season preserved beneath the earth. January patiently waiting beneath July. Snow remembered during harvest time. The Victorian world may not have possessed electricity, but certainly understood ingenuity. Coal was no longer simply a gift from winter. It had become something people could harvest, protect, transport, and use with remarkable skill. Yet demand continued to grow. Country estates and local businesses wanted more than nearby lakes could always provide. Some cities required ice on a scale that local winters simply could not satisfy. The solution would become one of the most astonishing commercial adventures of the 19th century. Because soon enormous sailing ships would begin carrying mountains of frozen water across entire oceans. And against all common sense, Much of that ice would actually arrive before it melted. If you had walked into a London coffee house in the early 19th century and confidently announced that one day people would make fortunes by shipping frozen water across tropical oceans, you would probably have been met with polite smiles, perhaps a few raised eyebrows. Someone might even have suggested that you sit down with a warm cup of tea and reconsider your business proposal. After all, the idea sounded wonderfully ridiculous. Take something that melts, load thousands of tons of it onto a wooden sailing ship, send it through blazing sunshine, tropical seas, and months of unpredictable weather, then somehow arrive with enough of it still frozen to sell at a profit. It sounded less like a business plan and more like the beginning of an expensive misunderstanding. And yet, that is exactly what happened. The Victorian age was full of people who looked at impossible ideas and thought, well, perhaps impossible is simply another engineering problem. The demand for natural ice had grown far beyond what many local lakes could provide. Large cities needed enormous quantities every summer. Hotels wanted it. Hospitals depended upon it. Breweries could hardly imagine operating without it. Wealthy households expected chilled drinks and fresh food regardless of the season. Even distant colonies in tropical climates dreamed of enjoying the comforts that natural ice could bring. There was only one obstacle: distance. Frozen lakes were rarely located where demand was greatest. Someone needed to connect the two. That task required extraordinary ambition. During the early 19th century, a handful of visionary merchants realized that the great frozen lakes of New England represented something far more valuable than beautiful winter scenery. They saw an export industry unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Each winter, thousands of workers harvested crystal-clear ice from lakes and ponds across the northeastern United States. The blocks were carefully stored in enormous ice houses until ships were ready to sail. Then the real adventure began. At busy harbors, long lines of horse-drawn wagons arrived carrying their frozen cargo. Workers unloaded each block with iron tongs and heavy wooden ramps. Every movement had been carefully planned. Time mattered. Even during the cold months, ice continued its slow battle against warmth. The ships themselves required careful preparation. Their cargo holds were unlike those used for timber, cotton, or grain. Instead, builders lined them with thick layers of insulating material. Pine boards formed sturdy walls. Between those walls came the true hero of the global ice trade. Again. There it was, quietly saving the day. Thousands of pounds of clean, dry sawdust surrounded the stacked ice blocks, filling every empty space. Tiny pockets of trapped air slowed the movement of heat, protecting the precious cargo throughout the long voyage. Simple, inexpensive, remarkably effective. Sometimes history's greatest innovations are not especially glamorous. No polished brass machinery. No complicated steam engines. Just frozen water and an astonishing amount of leftover wood shavings. Once loaded, the blocks resembled giant transparent bricks stacked neatly from floor to ceiling. The crews worked quickly, but carefully. Large gaps wasted valuable storage space. Poor stacking allowed blocks to shift during rough seas. Every inch mattered. When the final hatch was closed, the ice disappeared into darkness once again. There it would remain for weeks, sometimes months. The voyage itself demanded patience. Sailing ships depended entirely upon favorable winds. Some crossed the Atlantic with surprising speed. Others spent weeks drifting through calm seas while anxious captains quietly calculated how much of their cargo remained. One can only imagine those conversations. "Captain, we've lost another inch. Let's hope the wind becomes cooperative." Unfortunately, the wind had an unfortunate habit of ignoring commercial interests. Warm climates presented even greater challenges. As ships entered tropical waters, outside temperatures climbed dramatically. Decks became too hot to walk barefoot. The sun beat relentlessly upon the wooden hull. Below deck, however, the thick insulation continued performing its quiet miracle. Yes, some ice melted. That was expected. Every successful merchant accepted a certain amount of loss. The important question was whether enough remained to cover expenses and still produce a profit. Surprisingly often, the answer was yes. The first arrivals astonished local populations. Imagine living in a tropical port where snow had never fallen and frozen lakes existed only in stories told by distant travelers. Then one morning a ship arrived carrying enormous crystal-clear blocks colder than anything you had ever touched. Crowds gathered at the docks. Children stared in amazement. Adults reached out cautiously, placing curious fingers against the smooth frozen surface. Some reportedly struggled to believe such things could exist naturally. It must have seemed almost magical. Soon, natural ice appeared in places where people had never imagined enjoying chilled drinks during the hottest months of the year. Hotels proudly advertised cold beverages. Hospitals welcomed improved methods for preserving medicines and treating patients. Restaurants offered desserts that previously would have melted before reaching the table. Even colonial officials delighted in recreating a small piece of European comfort beneath tropical skies. Luxury traveled surprisingly well. Not every voyage succeeded. Storms occasionally delayed ships for weeks. Cargo shifted unexpectedly during rough weather. Some insulation became soaked with seawater, reducing its effectiveness. Occasionally, captains opened the hatches only to discover that far more of the precious cargo had melted than expected. Those losses could ruin an entire season's profits. Ice merchants accepted risk as part of the business. Nature remained an unpredictable business partner. Pirates, fortunately, showed little interest in stealing frozen water. Gold? Certainly. Silver? Without hesitation. Several thousand tons of slowly melting ice? Perhaps not worth the effort. It may be one of history's few valuable cargoes that became less attractive the longer someone delayed stealing it. By the middle of the 19th century, regular shipments connected frozen lakes in North America with ports across Europe, the Caribbean, South America, and even India. The scale became astonishing. Entire fleets participated in the trade. Harbors built specialized facilities for unloading. Cities constructed enormous commercial ice houses capable of storing imported cargo until summer demand reached its peak. A commodity once limited by geography had become global. It changed commerce. It changed medicine. It changed food. It even changed expectations. People began assuming that cold could be purchased, transported, and enjoyed almost anywhere. That idea seems perfectly ordinary today. At the time, It represented one of the most remarkable achievements of 19th century trade. The frozen harvest no longer belonged only to northern winters. It belonged to the world. And behind this extraordinary transformation stood a handful of ambitious entrepreneurs who believed that frozen lakes could become international gold mines. Many consider them dreamers. Some called them reckless. A few even laughed outright. Before long, however, several of those dreamers became astonishingly wealthy. By the middle of the 19th century, something extraordinary had happened. What had once been a simple winter chore carried out by local communities had become one of America's most surprising export industries. The country was no longer selling only timber, cotton, flour, or manufactured goods. It was exporting winter itself. Thousands upon thousands of tons of crystal-clear ice left the frozen lakes of New England every year, bound for ports scattered across the globe. Cargo ships departed Boston Harbor with holds packed tightly with enormous blocks harvested months earlier. Their destinations stretched far beyond the familiar Atlantic routes. London, Havana, Kingston, Rio de Janeiro, Calcutta, Singapore. Even cities baking beneath tropical suns soon found themselves serving chilled drinks made possible by lakes that froze solid every January. It sounds almost unbelievable. Yet it became remarkably ordinary. The man most closely associated with this astonishing trade was an ambitious Boston businessman who refused to accept that distance made such an enterprise impossible. While most people looked at a frozen pond and saw a pleasant winter landscape, he saw international commerce waiting beneath the snow. It required a certain kind of imagination, or depending on whom you asked, a delightful level of stubbornness. Friends admired his confidence. Competitors questioned his sanity. Bankers sometimes did both. His early proposals attracted more skepticism than enthusiasm. Shipping frozen water across thousands of miles of open ocean? Surely the cargo would melt long before reaching its destination. Surely no customer would pay enough to justify the expense. Surely someone had forgotten to perform even the most basic arithmetic. The calculations, however, proved surprisingly favorable. Natural ice cost relatively little to harvest compared with the value it commanded in warm climates. Winter supplied the raw material free of charge. The greatest expenses involved labor, storage, transportation, and careful insulation. If enough ice survived the voyage, the profits could be extraordinary. The first successful shipments changed everything. Suddenly, an idea that had seemed laughable became highly respectable. Success possesses a remarkable ability to improve people's opinions. Merchants who had once dismissed the business began searching for frozen lakes of their own. Investors who had politely declined earlier opportunities now expressed enthusiastic interest. One imagines the entrepreneur accepted these sudden changes of heart with quiet satisfaction. Across New England, harvesting expanded rapidly. Lakes in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, and beyond echoed each winter with the familiar sounds of saws, horses, and hard-working crews. Some harvesting companies employed hundreds of laborers during the busiest weeks. Others invested heavily in improved equipment, larger ice houses, and better transportation networks. Railroads soon joined the story. Before their arrival, moving enormous quantities of ice depended largely on horse-drawn wagons and nearby waterways. Useful, certainly. Efficient, only to a point. The expanding railroad system transformed distribution. Freshly harvested ice traveled quickly from inland lakes to busy ports and growing cities. Entire trainloads glittered beneath blankets of insulating sawdust as locomotives carried winter across the American landscape. Passengers waiting at country stations occasionally watched long freight cars packed with crystal-clear blocks rumble past. It must have looked rather unusual. An entire train devoted to frozen water. The export trade influenced far more than shipping companies. Boat builders received new orders for specialized cargo vessels. Carpenters constructed larger storage houses. Blacksmiths forged stronger hooks and sharper saws. Farmers supplied draft horses and hay. Sawmills discovered an unexpected market for something they had once considered little more than waste. Saws, again, quietly becoming one of history's least celebrated commercial heroes. Without it, much of the global ice trade might never have succeeded. Entire towns prospered because of the frozen harvest. Along New England's loch shores, winter no longer represented economic silence. Instead, it became one of the busiest seasons of the year. Hotels filled with traveling merchants. General stores sold tools, clothing, and supplies to seasonal workers. Families who depended upon farming found welcome income during the colder months. Children grew up expecting the annual arrival of harvesting crews almost as naturally as they expected spring planting. The rhythm of community life changed. Winter became productive. Of course, prosperity also encouraged competition. As more companies entered the industry, merchants searched constantly for ways to improve efficiency. Some developed better conveyor systems to lift blocks from the lake. Others invested in larger ice houses, capable of preserving enormous quantities throughout the year. Rail connections shortened delivery times. Improved insulation reduced losses during transport. Even small improvements produced impressive financial rewards when multiplied across thousands of tons of cargo. Innovation became a daily necessity. The American ice trade gradually developed an international reputation for reliability. Customers overseas expected clean, crystal-clear blocks harvested from carefully selected lakes. Quality mattered. Cloudy or dirty ice damaged a company's reputation. Experienced inspectors therefore examined harvesting sites with remarkable care. Only the finest natural ice earned a place aboard export ships. In many ways, these frozen blocks became ambassadors. Each shipment represented American craftsmanship, organization, and commercial ambition. The trade also revealed something deeper about the 19th century. It demonstrated humanity's growing confidence that nature itself could be organized, packaged, and transported across the globe. Winter was no longer confined to northern climates. Entrepreneurs had discovered a way to move an entire season. That idea felt revolutionary. Yet no empire lasts forever. Even as the natural ice trade reached astonishing heights, quiet changes were already beginning. Scientists experimented with artificial refrigeration. Inventors tinkered with strange machines capable of producing cold without waiting for snow or frozen lakes. At first, many ice merchants dismissed these inventions. The machines were expensive, complicated, sometimes unreliable. Besides, why manufacture ice when nature produced it for free every winter? It seemed a reasonable question. History, however, has an unfortunate habit of answering reasonable questions in unexpected ways. For the moment, though, America's frozen export empire stood at the peak of its power. Ships continued crossing oceans. Railways carried endless cargoes inland. Ice houses remained full. Customers remained eager. Winter itself had become one of the nation's most valuable exports. But behind every successful industry stood remarkable individuals whose ambition transformed impossible dreams into thriving businesses. Every great industry has its pioneers. The railroads had their ambitious engineers. The textile mills had their determined factory owners. The steamship companies had captains and entrepreneurs willing to gamble fortunes on the open sea. And the natural ice trade? It had a curious collection of businessmen who looked at frozen lakes and somehow saw unimaginable wealth. To almost everyone else, winter was simply another season. To these merchants, it was inventory. It takes a rather unusual mind to look across a frozen pond and think, "There's my next fortune." Yet that is exactly what happened. Among all the names connected with the natural ice trade, one became almost legendary. Frederick Tudor. Born into a prosperous Boston family, Tudor possessed an extraordinary combination of confidence, persistence, and optimism. Some people called it vision. Others probably called it stubbornness. History often struggles to tell the difference. As a young man, Tudor became fascinated by a simple question. Why should only people living in cold climates enjoy natural ice? If frozen lakes existed in abundance every winter, surely someone could transport that ice to places where it scarcely existed at all. The idea seemed wonderfully outrageous. His friends doubted him. Merchants laughed politely. Investors shook their heads. Experienced ship owners explained that ice had an unfortunate habit of melting, an observation that was, admittedly, difficult to argue with. Yet Tudor refused to abandon the dream. His first ventures were anything but smooth. Several early shipments lost enormous amounts of cargo before reaching their destinations. Expenses climbed. Profits disappeared. Creditors became increasingly impatient. At one point, Tudor accumulated debts so severe that he spent time in a debtor's prison. Not exactly the glamorous beginning one imagines for a future business empire. Many people would have accepted defeat. After all, the evidence seemed overwhelming. The business was too risky. The distances were too great. The losses too costly. Tudor reached a very different conclusion. The problem was not the idea. The problem was the method. That distinction changed everything. Rather than abandoning the trade, he focused on improving every stage of the journey. Better storage, better transportation, better insulation, better organization. Most importantly, he discovered that sawdust, an inexpensive byproduct of lumber mills, worked remarkably well as an insulating material. Once packed tightly around the ice, melting slowed dramatically. The improvement transformed the economics of the industry. Sometimes the smallest discoveries produce the greatest fortunes. With each successful shipment, confidence grew. Cargoes reached the Caribbean with far more ice remaining than anyone had expected. Soon, customers eagerly placed larger orders. Hotels advertised chilled drinks. Hospitals welcomed dependable supplies. Plantation owners embraced the luxury of cold food during tropical summers. Demand spread from island to island, then across continents. By the 1830s and 1840s, Tudor's business expanded into markets that had once seemed completely unreachable. Ships carrying New England ice sailed not only to the Caribbean but also to South America, Europe, and eventually India. The voyage to India was particularly astonishing. The journey lasted several months. The route crossed some of the warmest oceans on Earth. Common sense suggested that nothing frozen could possibly survive. Common sense, however, underestimated careful planning. Large portions of each cargo did melt during the voyage. That was expected. The remaining ice, though, still arrived in quantities large enough to generate healthy profits. Crowds gathered at the docks whenever these ships arrived. Many local residents had never touched natural ice before. Children stared with wide eyes. Adults cautiously placed their hands against the shimmering blocks, marveling at something that seemed almost impossible. Winter had crossed the equator. Success inspired imitators. Before long, other merchants entered the business, each hoping to carve out a share of the growing market. Competition intensified. Some companies invested in larger harvesting operations. Others built enormous commercial ice houses in distant ports. A few experimented with faster ships or improved loading techniques. Prices fluctuated. Markets shifted. The industry became increasingly sophisticated. Among the successful businessmen was Nathaniel Jarvis Wyeth, whose practical improvements revolutionized harvesting itself. Wyeth developed horse-drawn ice plows that scored perfectly straight grooves across frozen lakes. Instead of measuring and cutting every block individually, workers can now create enormous grids with remarkable speed and precision. Productivity soared. Labor costs fell. Harvests became larger than ever before. It was a reminder that great fortunes are rarely built on ambition alone. They also require better tools. The most successful merchants understood another important lesson. Their business did not end when the ship reached port. Ice houses had to be built in tropical cities. Reliable local distributors needed training. Customers required confidence that supplies would continue arriving year after year. A single successful shipment attracted curiosity. Consistent deliveries created an industry. That consistency demanded extraordinary attention to detail. Every harvest had to be carefully timed. Every storage house inspected. Every cargo measured. Every ship loaded with mathematical precision. A mistake made in January might not reveal itself until May, when disappointed customers opened an ice house thousands of miles away. The distance between cause and effect could span entire oceans. Remarkably, the greatest ice merchants became experts in subjects far beyond frozen lakes. They studied shipping routes, weather patterns, ocean currents, warehouse design, international trade, finance, insurance, even diplomacy. After all, selling ice in another country required cooperation from customs officials, harbor authorities, and local merchants. The business connected worlds that had previously shared little beyond occasional trade. Naturally, wealth followed. Some ice merchants accumulated fortunes that rivaled those earned in more famous industries. Elegant homes appeared. Charitable donations increased. Business empires expanded into banking, shipping, and real estate. Men once ridiculed for chasing impossible dreams became respected members of society. One suspects a few early critics quietly forgot their original opinions. Success has always possessed a remarkable ability to improve memory. Yet even the richest merchant remained dependent upon one unpredictable partner: nature. A single unusually warm winter could reduce the harvest dramatically. A violent storm might delay ships for weeks. An unexpected thaw could destroy carefully stored supplies. Unlike factories that produced goods year-round, the natural ice industry relied entirely upon seasons behaving as expected. That uncertainty never disappeared. Perhaps it kept even the wealthiest merchants humble, or at least slightly nervous every time they checked the weather. By the late 19th century, these remarkable entrepreneurs had transformed frozen water into an international commodity worth millions of dollars. Their achievements seemed almost miraculous. Entire cities relied upon their deliveries. Industries flourished because of their organization. Countless people enjoyed healthier food, cooler homes, and improved medical care thanks to the winter harvest. It appeared that the empire of natural ice might continue forever. History, however, rarely allows any industry to enjoy permanent success. Even as the ice merchants celebrated record profits, danger approached from an unexpected direction. It did not arrive on horseback, or aboard sailing ships, or through unusually warm winters. It emerged quietly from laboratories, workshops, and machine rooms where inventors were learning how to create cold without waiting for nature at all. For all its beauty, the frozen lake never stopped being a frozen lake. That sounds almost too obvious to mention. Yet after weeks of successful harvesting, it became surprisingly easy for workers to forget the simple truth beneath their boots. They were not standing on solid ground. They were standing on water. Very cold water. The smooth surface, neatly divided into perfect grids, could create a comforting illusion of safety. Horses followed familiar routes. Workers repeated the same tasks day after day. Foremen called out instructions with practiced confidence. The entire operation felt orderly, almost routine. But winter had a habit of reminding everyone that it remained in charge. No matter how many seasons a man had worked on the ice, nature never signed a contract promising predictable behavior. Every morning began with a careful inspection. Before the first horse stepped onto the lake, experienced foremen walked the harvesting field with quiet concentration. Overnight temperatures could strengthen the ice, or weaken it. A sudden snowfall might conceal a dangerous crack. A change in the wind could shift pressure across the lake. Even the distant sound of flowing water beneath the surface might signal that conditions had changed. Nothing was taken for granted. The workers had learned an important lesson from generations before them. Trust the ice. Respect the ice. Never become too comfortable on the ice. That final lesson was perhaps the hardest. Routine breeds confidence. Confidence sometimes invites carelessness, and carelessness rarely received a second chance. The most common danger was surprisingly simple: slipping. The lake was, after all, an enormous sheet of frozen water. Despite iron cleats fitted to boots and careful walking habits, workers occasionally lost their footing. Most falls ended with bruised pride, sore elbows, and good-natured laughter from nearby companions. History suggests that even Victorian laborers appreciated a harmless tumble, provided it happened to someone else. Unfortunately, not every fall remained harmless. Heavy hooks, sharp chisels, long saws, and enormous floating blocks surrounded the crews throughout the day. A poorly timed slip could result in broken bones or serious injuries. The tools that made the harvest possible demanded constant respect. Then there were the cracks. Every frozen lake spoke its own language. Long, low groans rolled beneath the ice as temperatures changed. Sharp pops echoed across the surface. Deep booming sounds sometimes traveled for astonishing distances. To newcomers, the noises were terrifying. To experienced workers, most were perfectly ordinary. Ice expands. Ice contracts. Ice complains about both. The truly dangerous sounds were different. They were sudden, unexpected, followed by movement. When a foreman shouted for everyone to stop, no one argued. Men froze where they stood. Horses halted. Even the busiest worksite could become silent in an instant. I searched the surface for widening fractures or dark patches where water might be forcing its way upward. Sometimes the danger passed quickly. Sometimes an entire section of a harvesting field had to be abandoned. No shipment of ice was worth gambling with dozens of lives. The weather itself often became an enemy. A clear winter morning could transform into a blinding snowstorm before noon. Strong winds swept loose snow across the lake, erasing carefully marked paths within minutes. Visibility shrank dramatically. Workers struggled to distinguish solid ground from freshly cut channels hidden beneath drifting snow. The world became white in every direction. More than one crew found themselves navigating by memory alone. That was never an ideal situation. Extreme cold created problems of its own. Hands gradually lost feeling despite thick gloves. Wet clothing stiffened with ice. Beards collected long white icicles. Metal tools became painfully cold to touch. A moment of carelessness could leave skin frozen against bare steel. Winter was patient. It found every weakness eventually. Even the mighty draft horses faced constant risks. The animals pulled extraordinary loads across uncertain surfaces for hours at a time. Most completed their work safely. Some stumbled. A broken harness could send heavy sledges sliding unexpectedly. Fresh snow sometimes concealed dangerous ridges in the ice. Occasionally, a frightened horse lost its footing while hauling several tons of frozen cargo. Handlers reacted immediately, calming the animal before panic spread through the team. Their experience saved countless accidents. Yet everyone feared one particular possibility: breaking through the ice. Despite weeks of careful inspection, hidden weak spots occasionally escaped detection. Perhaps an underground spring had warmed the water below. Perhaps changing weather had weakened one section more rapidly than expected. Perhaps nature simply chose that moment to remind humanity who truly controlled the lake. Without warning, the surface might collapse beneath a horse, a loaded sledge, or a group of workers. The icy water below was unimaginably cold. Within moments, heavy clothing became soaked. Movement grew difficult. Strength faded quickly. Nearby crews rushed to help without hesitation. Long ropes were thrown. Wooden ladders spread the rescuers' weight across the ice. Planks were pushed toward anyone struggling in the water. Every second mattered. Most rescues succeeded because everyone understood exactly what to do. The harvesting companies had learned through painful experience. Preparation saved lives. Still, not every story ended happily. Historical records describe workers who never returned home after accidents on frozen lakes. Some were overcome by the freezing water before help reached them. Others suffered severe injuries from shifting blocks or collapsing equipment. Entire communities mourned these losses. The winter harvest, for all its economic importance, demanded a price that could never be measured in money alone. And yet, each season the workers came back, not because they underestimated the danger. Quite the opposite. They understood it completely. They returned because the harvest fed their families, because the wages paid overdue debts, because spring planting required money earned during winter, because life in the 19th century rarely offered easy choices. Courage in those days often looked remarkably ordinary. It looked like a farmer pulling on frozen boots before dawn, a blacksmith sharpening another saw, a horse driver adjusting leather harnesses with numb fingers, a laborer stepping carefully onto the ice once more, fully aware of the risks waiting beneath the smooth white surface. There was no applause, no cheering crowds, only quiet determination. Perhaps that is what makes these workers so remarkable today. They did not think of themselves as heroes. They simply considered themselves people doing necessary work. As evening approached, the crews packed away their tools once again. The last horses trudged slowly toward the shore. Lanterns flickered in the growing darkness. Behind them, the frozen lake gradually returned to silence, its dangers hidden once more beneath moonlight and drifting snow. Tomorrow the harvest would continue. Winter would continue. Life would continue. Because history has always been shaped not only by kings and inventors, but also by ordinary men and women willing to face extraordinary conditions in pursuit of an honest day's work. Yet despite every hardship, the greatest challenge facing the natural ice industry would not come from storms, hidden cracks, or bitter cold. Its greatest enemy would arrive quietly, not from nature, but from human invention. A machine that could create ice anywhere, anytime, in any season. And it would change everything. For all the careful planning, remarkable engineering, and tireless labor that defined a Victorian ice trade, there remained one opponent that no merchant, no foreman, and no entrepreneur could ever truly defeat. Heat. It never hurried. It never shouted. It simply waited. Patiently. Silently. And eventually it always arrived. Every person involved in the natural ice industry understood one uncomfortable truth from the very beginning. Their product was disappearing. Every single day. Even inside the finest ice house, protected by thick stone walls, buried beneath the earth, wrapped in generous blankets of sawdust, and shielded from the summer sun, every block slowly surrendered a tiny part of itself. It was a business built upon managing the inevitable. The goal was never to stop melting. That would have been impossible. The goal was simply to make it happen slowly enough to earn a profit first. It was a race against time, and sometimes time won. The greatest fear of every ice merchant was not an especially cold winter. It was an unusually warm one. A winter that arrived late. A winter that refused to settle. A winter where lakes froze for a few hopeful days before softening again beneath unexpected sunshine. Workers would gather at the shoreline, staring across water that should have been solid by now. Their saws remained sharpened. The horses were ready. The storage houses stood empty. But nature had not yet given permission. The waiting became almost unbearable. Each morning began with cautious optimism. Perhaps tonight the temperature would finally drop. Perhaps next week. Perhaps the cold was simply delayed. Meanwhile, contracts had already been signed. Hotels expected deliveries. Breweries planned their summer production. Hospitals counted on reliable supplies. Merchants faced an uncomfortable reality. One could not harvest ice that did not exist. Some winters proved generous. Others became legendary disappointments. Newspapers occasionally reported entire regions struggling through unusually mild seasons. Lakes that normally carry dozens of harvesting crews remained stubbornly unfrozen. Companies searched farther north for better conditions. Transportation costs increased. Profits shrank. Everyone watched the weather with growing concern. And then there were the early thaws. Perhaps the harvest had begun successfully. The first weeks went according to plan. Thousands of blocks rested safely inside growing stacks. Foremen congratulated their crews. Business owners calculated encouraging profits. Then the wind changed. A few warmer days arrived. Rain followed. The surface of the lake darkened. Small streams of meltwater began weaving quietly across the once solid ice. At first, nobody panicked. Winter weather often fluctuated. Surely the cold would return. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. Experienced workers recognized the warning signs immediately. The edges of the harvesting fields softened. Previously sharp corners became rounded. Channels widened. The reassuring sounds of hard, solid ice gave way to dull, waterlogged echoes. Every hour became precious. Crews worked from dawn until dusk, racing to rescue as much of the harvest as possible before nature reclaimed it. The pace quickened. Horse teams hauled heavier loads. Conveyor systems rarely stopped. Meals became shorter, breaks fewer. Everyone understood what was happening. The lake was slipping away. One can almost imagine the conversations. Just one more day. If the temperature holds tonight, we can still save most of it. Hope lingered until the very end. Occasionally, it was rewarded. Often, it was not. There were seasons when entire harvesting operations ended weeks earlier than expected. The remaining ice became too dangerous to support heavy equipment. Safety demanded retreat. Workers packed away their tools while unfinished blocks floated quietly in widening pools of dark water. Nature had reclaimed its own. Perhaps the most heartbreaking losses occurred after the harvest itself. Imagine spending weeks cutting, transporting, and stacking thousands of tons of beautiful crystal-clear ice. Everything appeared successful. The storage houses were full. Customers had placed generous orders. Then, during midsummer, disaster struck. A poorly constructed roof allowed warm air to enter. Drainage channels became blocked. Water pooled around the lower layers of ice. Insulation shifted unexpectedly. Small problems multiplied. One afternoon, workers opened the heavy doors expecting to retrieve another day's supply. Instead, they found enormous sections of the carefully stacked harvest collapsing into slushy heaps. Months of labor disappearing before their eyes. It must have been a devastating sight. The melting itself was strangely quiet. There was no dramatic explosion, no towering flames, only the slow drip, drip, drip of winter quietly surrendering to summer. History often associates disasters with noise. The loss of an ice harvest happened almost silently, yet the financial consequences echoed for months. Merchants struggled to fulfill contracts. Hotels rationed their remaining supplies. Breweries reduced production. Prices climbed sharply as demand exceeded availability. Families who relied on seasonal employment worried about the coming year. One failed harvest affected entire communities. The global trade introduced additional risks. Ships crossing warm oceans accepted that some cargo would melt. That was expected. What nobody wanted was excessive loss. Occasionally, storms delayed voyages for weeks. Calm winds left sailing ships drifting beneath relentless tropical sunshine. Every extra day at sea meant another portion of the cargo quietly vanished. Captains calculated their remaining inventory with growing anxiety. Would enough survive? Would the buyers still pay? Would the voyage cover its enormous costs? Sometimes the answers were encouraging. Sometimes they were painfully disappointing. Insurance companies gradually became familiar with these unusual claims. Most businesses insured ships against storms. The natural ice trade also worried about whether that was too pleasant, too warm, too calm. Few industries have ever viewed bright sunshine with such suspicion. Even successful harvests faced another unavoidable challenge: waste. Tiny fragments broke away during cutting. Corners chipped during transport. Smaller pieces melted too quickly for long-distance shipping. Fortunately, Victorian merchants disliked waste with remarkable determination. Broken ice found countless uses. Breweries crushed it for cooling vats. Fishmongers packed fresh catches between irregular chunks. Hospitals requested smaller pieces for medical treatments. Restaurants used chipped ice to chill bottles and preserve delicate ingredients. Almost nothing was discarded if it could still provide cooling. Necessity encouraged remarkable efficiency. Still, no amount of thrift could overcome a truly disastrous season. Entire fortunes sometimes depended upon weather patterns that no one could predict. The wealthiest merchant remained powerless before an unusually warm February. Perhaps that uncertainty explains why successful ice traders developed such deep respect for winter. They did not merely hope for cold weather. They depended upon it. Every frozen morning represented opportunity. Every unexpected thaw carried quiet anxiety, and every successful harvest felt almost like a gift. By the late 19th century, however, another possibility began attracting attention. What if people no longer needed to wait for winter at all? What if cold could be manufactured? What if ice could be produced on demand, regardless of the season, the weather, or the climate? At first, such ideas sounded almost as improbable as shipping frozen lakes across tropical oceans had once sounded. History, however, had already demonstrated something important. Impossible ideas have a curious habit of becoming ordinary. Long before thermometers became commonplace, before weather forecasts arrived with remarkable accuracy, and certainly before anyone could check tomorrow's temperature on a glowing little rectangle in their pocket, winter remained wonderfully mysterious. People observed it. They respected it. And every now and then, they invented some rather unusual explanations for it. The Victorian age is often remembered as a time of science, industry, and invention. That reputation is well deserved. Yet even during an era of railways, steam engines, and telegraphs, old beliefs lingered quietly in villages, farming communities, and lakeside towns where generations had lived close to the rhythms of nature. The ice harvest existed in a curious space between science and folklore. Workers measured thickness with precision. They understood insulation. They calculated storage capacity. Then, after finishing an entirely rational day's work, some might quietly avoid whistling on the frozen lake because everyone knew it brought bad luck. Human beings have always been wonderfully consistent in that regard. Many harvesters believed every lake possessed its own personality. Not literally, perhaps, but almost. Some lakes were described as generous. Others were stubborn. A few were said to become angry after sudden changes in the weather. Experienced workers often spoke about familiar lakes with surprising affection. This one freezes early. That one never likes a warm wind. You can trust the North Bay. Whether these comments reflected careful observation or harmless superstition hardly mattered. The lakes became old companions. Their habits were remembered almost like those of lifelong friends. Among the most widespread beliefs involved the mysterious sounds made by expanding and contracting ice. On quiet nights, frozen lakes produced deep groans, sharp cracks, distant booms, and long rolling echoes that seemed to travel beneath the entire landscape. Modern science explains these noises quite comfortably. Changing temperatures cause the ice to expand and contract, releasing enormous amounts of stored stress. Perfectly natural. Entirely harmless in most cases. Victorian workers knew much of this from experience. Even so, many still preferred not to ignore the sounds completely. Some joked that the lake was talking. Others claimed it was settling down for the night. A few older laborers quietly removed their hats whenever particularly loud cracks echoed beneath their feet. Not because they feared ghosts, simply because respect had never harmed anyone. And perhaps because removing one's hat felt considerably easier than arguing with several centuries of local tradition. Whistling attracted special suspicion in certain communities. According to old folklore carried across generations, whistling while standing on a frozen lake invited strong winds. Strong winds brought drifting snow. Drifting snow hid dangerous cracks. Therefore, no whistling. Was the belief scientifically accurate? Not in the slightest. Did many workers choose to remain silent anyway? Quite possibly. After all, there was very little to lose by keeping one's favorite tune until reaching dry land. Several harvesting crews also avoided beginning the season on certain dates considered unlucky by local tradition. Some preferred starting on a Monday. Others insisted Wednesday brought the greatest fortune. Friday divided opinion dramatically. For some communities, it represented blessing. For others, misfortune. The foreman occasionally found himself balancing weather conditions with inherited family customs. One imagined scheduling meetings became unexpectedly philosophical. Birds inspired another collection of fascinating beliefs. The appearance of ravens near the lake sometimes prompted uneasy glances. Owls calling before dawn could be interpreted as warnings that the weather might soon change. On the other hand, seeing flocks of wild geese flying unusually low often encouraged optimism. Many considered it a sign that colder air followed close behind. Interestingly, this last observation occasionally possessed a grain of truth. Migrating birds do respond to changing weather patterns. Folklore and careful observation often share the same roots. Dreams also found their place in winter traditions. Some workers claimed dreaming about clear ice before the harvest promised an excellent season. Dreaming about flowing water suggested delays. Snow in dreams supposedly meant prosperity. Rain hinted at disappointment. No company accountant ever included these forecasts in the official records. Still, they provided enjoyable conversation during cold breakfasts beside crackling kitchen fires. The horses, too, acquired their share of quiet traditions. Many drivers developed favorite lead horses, believing certain animals somehow brought better luck than others. An especially calm horse that had safely completed many harvests became almost legendary within a crew. Its familiar presence inspired confidence, perhaps not because it possessed magical abilities, simply because experience is reassuring. People often confuse reliability with luck. The distinction hardly matters when both produce the same comforting result. Some harvesting families preserve small seasonal rituals passed down for generations. A first block of ice might be touched gently for good fortune. A quiet word of thanks might be offered after the opening cut. Others carried tiny keepsakes inside coat pockets throughout the season. A smooth stone, an old coin, a carved wooden charm. None interfered with the work. None replaced practical safety. They simply accompanied it. Human beings have always appreciated small reminders of hope, even in an age increasingly devoted to science. Perhaps especially then. One charming belief suggested that exceptionally clear ice reflected the honesty of the coming season. Cloudy ice supposedly warned of unnecessary arguments among workers. Needless to say, foremen generally blamed disagreements on long hours and difficult weather rather than frozen moral philosophy. Still, the story survived, and there is something rather delightful about imagining a lake quietly judging everyone's behavior. As winter evenings settled over the villages, families gathered around warm fireplaces while older relatives shared stories from earlier harvests. They spoke of legendary winters when the ice seemed endless, of impossible snowstorms, of miraculous rescues, of mysterious lights dancing across frozen lakes beneath brilliant stars. Some tales undoubtedly grew a little larger with each passing year. That, too, is part of history. Facts build the foundation. Stories furnish the house. Even educated Victorians who embraced science often saw little harm in preserving harmless traditions. One could believe in thermometers while still wishing for good fortune. One could calculate ice thickness precisely while quietly avoiding unnecessary risks that old customs warned against. Reason and tradition often walked side by side. Neither seemed especially eager to dismiss the other completely. Perhaps that balance explains why the ice harvest occupies such a fascinating place in history. It was an industry powered by mathematics, engineering, and careful organization. Yet it remained deeply connected to seasons, weather, memory, and generations of shared experience. The workers respected measurements. They also respected stories. And sometimes those stories made long winter days feel just a little warmer. As the 19th century drew toward its close, however, old traditions would soon confront a future unlike anything their ancestors had imagined. Machines capable of producing artificial ice were improving rapidly. Electricity crept steadily into cities. The frozen lakes that had inspired so many customs, superstitions, and family stories would gradually grow quieter. For generations, the natural ice industry had seemed almost unstoppable. Every winter, frozen lakes filled with workers. Every spring, enormous ice houses brimmed with carefully stacked crystal blocks. Every summer, wagons rattled through city streets delivering winter to homes, hotels, breweries, hospitals, and grand country estates. The system was elegant, reliable, beautifully organized. It had one small inconvenience. It depended entirely upon the weather. And history has never been particularly fond of industries that rely on asking nature for permission. Toward the end of the 19th century, something remarkable began happening inside workshops, laboratories, breweries, and engineering firms. Inventors started asking a question that had once sounded almost absurd. What if people no longer needed frozen lakes at all? What if coal itself could be manufactured? Not harvested, not stored, created. At first, even many scientists regarded the idea with cautious skepticism. Making fire was easy enough. Human beings had mastered that thousands of years earlier. Making cold, however, felt strangely unnatural. After all, cold is not really something that exists by itself. It is simply the absence of heat. To create cold, one must persuade heat to go somewhere else. That sounds deceptively simple. It is rather like saying becoming wealthy merely requires acquiring more money. Technically correct. Wonderfully unhelpful. Fortunately, Victorian engineers possessed remarkable patience. Long before electricity reached most homes, inventors were already experimenting with machines that compressed and expanded gases in carefully controlled cycles. They discovered that certain gases absorbed heat as they evaporated and released it again when compressed. By repeating this process continuously, a machine could remove heat from enclosed space. In other words, it could make things cold. The principle was revolutionary. Instead of waiting for January, businesses could create ice in July. Instead of hoping lakes froze deeply enough, factories could manufacture steady supplies every single day. Nature was no longer the only supplier. The earliest machines were hardly elegant. They were enormous, complicated, expensive, filled with pipes, valves, pumps, and heavy iron machinery that occupied entire rooms. They hissed, clanked, rumbled, leaked occasionally, and demanded constant attention from skilled engineers. No sensible homeowner wanted one in the kitchen. Quite frankly, most kitchens would have needed an additional wall simply to fit the thing inside. Yet despite their awkward appearance, the machines worked. slowly at first, sometimes unreliably, but undeniably. Breweries became among the earliest enthusiastic customers. For decades, they had depended upon natural ice harvested each winter to maintain the cool temperatures necessary for brewing. Warm weather complicated production enormously. Now mechanical refrigeration offered something extraordinary. Consistency. Whether January or August, the brewing process remained almost identical. Beer makers appreciated predictability almost as much as they appreciated clean equipment, perhaps more. Meatpacking companies quickly recognized another advantage. Fresh meat spoiled rapidly during warm weather, limiting how far it could be transported. Mechanical refrigeration changed those calculations overnight. Large refrigerated storage rooms allowed businesses to preserve enormous quantities safely. Railway companies soon developed refrigerated freight cars, carrying meat across entire countries regardless of season. The humble ice harvest had quietly transformed global food distribution. Hospitals also embraced the new technology. Reliable cooling improved the storage of medicines and medical supplies. Operating rooms became more manageable during hot summers. Doctors no longer worried quite so desperately about dwindling ice supplies late in the season. Artificial refrigeration offered certainty where nature offered only hope. The natural ice merchants watched these developments with mixed emotions. Some dismissed the machines outright. Too expensive, too complicated, too unreliable. They argued, quite reasonably, that frozen lakes produced enormous quantities of excellent ice free of charge every winter. Why invest in costly machinery when nature continued doing the job perfectly well? It seemed like sound business logic. And for a time, it was. Many mechanical refrigeration systems remained beyond the financial reach of ordinary businesses. Maintenance required specialized knowledge. Breakdowns could halt production unexpectedly. Natural ice remained cheaper in many regions. The old industry continued thriving alongside the new. For a while, history often introduces revolutions quietly. One improvement follows another. Machines become slightly smaller, slightly cheaper, slightly more dependable. Year after year, engineers refined compressors, improved insulation, strengthened materials, and developed safer refrigerants. Each individual advance appeared modest. Together, they became unstoppable. Some of the most fascinating moments occurred when old and new technologies briefly worked together. Large commercial ice factories still purchased natural ice during particularly busy seasons. Traditional ice merchants invested in mechanical equipment as insurance against poor winters. Breweries maintained their ice houses while gradually expanding refrigerated facilities. The transition was rarely sudden. It unfolded over decades. Entire generations witnessed both worlds existing side by side. Horse-drawn wagons delivering natural ice rolled past factories manufacturing artificial ice only a few streets away. It must have been a curious sight. Yesterday and tomorrow sharing the same road. The workers felt the changes most deeply. Families whose livelihoods had depended upon winter harvesting for generations began noticing fewer contracts. Some lakes that once buzzed with hundreds of laborers grew noticeably quieter. Ice houses remained partly empty. Export shipments declined. Not because winter had failed, Because customers increasingly possessed another choice. Choice changes markets faster than almost anything else. Interestingly, the arrival of mechanical refrigeration did not immediately eliminate natural ice. Many people preferred the clear appearance of lake ice. Some believed it lasted longer. Others simply trusted what they had always known. Habits rarely disappear overnight. Even after factories became common, natural ice continued serving countless homes and businesses well into the early 20th century. Still, the direction of history had become unmistakable. Machines did not grow tired. They did not wait for lakes to freeze. They did not worry about unusually warm winters. They simply continued working, hour after hour, day after day, season after season. The frozen harvest that had once seemed indispensable now faced a competitor unlike any it had ever encountered. Not another merchant, not another country, not another unusually mild winter. It faced technology itself. And history has repeatedly shown that once a practical invention becomes affordable, organized, and reliable, it rarely remains confined to workshops for very long. The age of harvesting winter was slowly giving way to the age of manufacturing cold. Yet the story was not entirely one of loss. The natural ice industry had changed the world long before machines arrived. It had taught engineers how to store cold, inspired better insulation, created global trade networks, improved medicine, expanded food preservation, and demonstrated that even something as ordinary as frozen water could reshape civilization when guided by human ingenuity. In the next chapter, we'll watch the quiet decline of the great ice harvest itself, exploring how the once bustling frozen lakes gradually fell silent, leaving behind abandoned ice houses, forgotten tools, and memories of an industry that had preserved summer for generations before disappearing into history. So, as our journey gently comes to an end, the frozen lakes of the Victorian world grow quiet once more. The horses have returned to their warm stables. The great iron saws rest against weathered wooden walls. The workers have gone home, their footprints slowly disappearing beneath a fresh blanket of snow. The long lines of crystal-clear ice blocks have vanished into memory, and the only sound left is the soft winter wind moving across the empty lake. It is peaceful now. Almost impossible to imagine that this silent place was once the center of an industry that connected villages to great cities, country estates to distant colonies, and frozen American lakes to tropical ports thousands of miles away. For a brief moment in history, people discovered how to capture an entire season. They harvested winter itself. They stored it beneath the earth. They carried it across oceans. They served it in elegant dining rooms, crowded hospitals, humble kitchens, and bustling breweries, all without a single electric motor humming in the background. It feels almost magical today. Yet it was simply the result of patience, careful observation, and thousands of ordinary people doing extraordinary work. History often celebrates kings, queens, inventors, and famous generals. But tonight, perhaps we can spare a quiet thought for the anonymous ice cutters whose names rarely appeared in history books. The men who stood for hours on frozen lakes beneath pale winter skies. The women who prepared warm meals before sunrise and mended frozen gloves by firelight. The children who watched the harvest from snowy hillsides, believing the floating blocks of ice looked like giant pieces of glass drifting across dark water. Most of them never imagined they were changing the world. They were simply earning a living. And sometimes, those are the people who leave the deepest mark on history. The arrival of mechanical refrigeration eventually silenced the great winter harvests. The conveyor belt stopped turning. The horses no longer pulled endless sledges across the lakes. Many ice houses were abandoned, their heavy doors left closed for the final time. Nature slowly reclaimed what industry had borrowed. Today, if you visit many of those old lakes during winter, you may find nothing more than fishermen, skaters, or snow-covered trees reflected in the frozen surface. The neat harvesting grids have long disappeared. The shouting foremen are gone. The busy work crews exist only in faded photographs and aging journals. And yet, if you stand there on a still January morning, when the air is perfectly calm and the snow muffles every distant sound, it is not difficult to imagine the past returning for just a moment. Perhaps you can almost hear the faint scrape of an iron saw somewhere across the lake, the gentle creak of a wooden sledge, the quiet jingle of harnesses as patient horses begin another day's work. Maybe it is only the wind. Or perhaps history never completely leaves the places where ordinary people once labored with such determination. There is something comforting about that thought. The Victorian ice harvest reminds us that progress is not only built by spectacular inventions. Sometimes it grows from careful routines repeated thousands of times. A measured cut, a steady hand, a shared meal beside a winter fire. A block of ice lifted from a frozen lake with the hope that it might preserve food, ease suffering, or simply make a hot summer afternoon a little more comfortable. Small acts, repeated by countless hands. Together, they changed everyday life for millions of people. And perhaps there is another quiet lesson hidden within the story. The natural ice trade was never really about ice alone. It was about cooperation, about communities working together, about adapting to the seasons instead of fighting them, about finding remarkable solutions using the simplest materials: stone, timber, horses, sawdust, and human patience. In our own fast-moving world, where cold appears at the touch of a button and refrigerators hum so quietly we rarely notice them, it is easy to forget how precious such comforts once were. Every chilled drink, every preserved meal, every cool hospital room, every frozen dessert, all of them trace part of their story back to those frozen lakes and the people who harvested winter by hand. Their work has faded into history, but its influence remains all around us. And now, as the stars slowly appear above the quiet lake, the last traces of daylight disappear beyond the snow-covered trees. The wind grows softer. The frozen surface glows faintly beneath the moon. Everything is still. Everything is calm. Thank you for joining me on tonight's sleepy journey through the patient seasonal harvesting of ice for Victorian estates. If you enjoyed relaxing with this forgotten chapter of history, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Leave a comment below and let me know what historical story you'd like us to drift into next. And if gentle journeys through the quieter corners of the past help you unwind, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next peaceful adventure. Now, settle a little deeper into your pillow. Let your breathing slow. Allow the quiet rhythm of the frozen lake to fade gently into the distance. And as winter settles peacefully over the silent water one final time, sleep well. I'll see you in the next journey through history. Good night.